James Bond.
I know who you are, what you are, and why you've come. You have made a mistake.
The situation for James Bond seemed grim in the early 1970s. George Lazenby was a bit of a dud with audiences and decided to walk after only one film. Sean Connery had left the role and was enticed to come back, but only for one more. 1973 would see the introduction of yet a third actor to play Bond, and like before, there was a lot of speculation as to who would wear the shoulder holster. Cubby and Harry returned to seek out old favorites like Michael Billington and John Gavin, and it's from this pool that they found their man, Roger Moore. Moore was well known as a TV star, and yet it seemed destined that he would land the role at some point. He had been in the running for a while, allegedly even being considered as far back as 1962 for Dr. No, and even played the character of Bond in the TV show Mainly Millicent for a comedy skit. Upon completion of You Only Live Twice, Moore was actually being talked to about doing a version of The Man with the Golden Gun, which was to be shot in Cambodia, which ultimately ended up never happening. He was good friends with Cubby and Harry for years, and after a second season of his current show, The Persuaders, fell through, he was quickly scooped up by the producers. Much of the same creative team from past films returned, most notably Guy Hamilton and writer Tom Mankiewicz. Guy was reluctant as he didn't want to be stuck only doing Bond films. Yet the gauntlet was thrown down when the producers offered the challenge to make a successful Bond film without Connery, and Hamilton found that he couldn't refuse. The venture paid off, as not only did the film end up making more money than Diamonds Are Forever, but despite critical reviews being mixed to somewhat positive at the time, Live and Let Die went on to become one of the more popular films of the series with general audiences. The plot starts off with an intriguing sequence where 3 agents are killed in suspicious circumstances while trying to investigate Dr. Kananga, the ruler of a Caribbean island called San Monique. James Bond is sent to New York, only to find himself in a web of danger and espionage. With the help of Felix Leiter, Bond finds out that there is a connection between Kananga and the mob boss known as Mr. Big. After this revelation, he travels to San Monique to get a closer look at Kananga and his mysterious accomplice Solitaire, who has the power of the tarot and can foresee Bond's efforts. Bond has to wade through the cloud of illusions and magic in order to discover Dr. Kananga's larger plans and how to thwart them. Live and Let Die carries over some of the lighter tone of Diamonds, as well as trying to return to its espionage roots. A lot of the film is infused with a great sense of misdirection. You don't know who all is on Bond's side, and you're left wondering who is just around the corner trying to kill him. The filmmakers wisely decided to abandon the original novel's plot of sunken pirate gold and try for something else. On this most recent viewing, I noticed plenty of connections between this and Dr. No, some of which I had never noticed before. Beyond the obvious of both films introduce an actor as Bond and are set in the Caribbean, both films start with a mysterious set of deaths, both feature Bond's home in some capacity, and that scene involves having sex with a woman before leaving on a mission. Both feature several attempts on Bond's life, one of which involves an animal. There is both a driver working for the villain and a female that Bond beds before revealing her deception. Both feature a man named Quarrel as a key ally along with Felix Leiter. And finally, Dr. Kananga and Dr. No share quite a bit in common. They are both absolute rulers in their respective domains that use superstition to enlarge in their images. I noted in my Dr. No review that Bond's quip comparing the man to a minnow pretending to be a whale was accurate. Here, Kananga is using voodoo mysticism and theatricality to instill fear into the locals, accomplishing much the same idea. I'm not sure how intentional this was, but I found it fascinating to see that this film took elements from Dr. No and reused them in fairly non-intrusive ways. I wouldn't call Live and Let Die a remake of that film, but perhaps a bit of a remix. Guy Hamilton was determined to fill this movie up with plenty of entertaining scenes and performances, so that if for some reason you didn't like Roger as Bond, you'd still have enough left over to have a good time with the movie. However, that's not to say that Guy shows a reluctance in adapting the series to a new actor. Both he and writer Tom Mankiewicz do a great job of making Moore a clear contrast to Connery. Much was made in the press at the time about Roger taking over from Sean, and the filmmakers were keenly aware of this challenge. Roger's Bond still carries over what he should from Sean's, and yet it feels like a new emphasis on the same template. Roger is far more quippy, approachable, and perhaps a touch more mellow. If you walked into a room with Sean's Bond, you wouldn't know whether he would try to kill you first or charm you. Roger would definitely go the charm route before killing you if he had to. The gentlemanly aspect of the character was highlighted, and I have a feeling this is more what we would have gotten if David Niven had been allowed to play Bond in a serious film. Now, that's not to say that Roger himself was entirely farcical or out of touch with the pulse of the series. On the contrary, he has his darker moments too, and doesn't shrink from indulging on his darker tendencies if the occasion makes it necessary. He feels like a valid reinterpretation of the character, and I think both Moore's and Connery's portrayals are logical takes on the same man. It'll take until The Spy Who Loved Me before the style of Moore's Bond was completely cemented and found its groove, but this was a great first try. I've always had a fondness for Yaphet Kotto as Dr. Kananga. Various interviews and stories have stated that he was difficult to work with, which is a shame because I think Kananga is one of the better bad guys we've encountered up to this point. He's quite calm and collected a lot of the time, and yet can become mean and loud on a dime. He feels like a dog with bite, and I would actually be somewhat scared of this guy if I ever ran across him. I'm not as enamored with his Mr. Big persona, although that might be due to our lack of time with him. I do appreciate that Kotto clearly plays him as being different to Kananga, so the deception is a bit more plausible, though I don't ever recall being surprised to learn that they were one and the same. This film just has a great cast of villains. I've said several times before that the three films that have the best overall cast of bad guys are Goldfinger, GoldenEye, and Live and Let Die. Even henchmen that have no credited name like the taxi driver are memorable. Teehee captures the similar balance between fun and menace that Kananga does. The hook for a hand is a nice idea, and I love how it gets used throughout the film. He also gets to continue Hamilton's weird fascination about having a baddie come back for the final scene to have one last shot at Bond. Perhaps the biggest impression is made by Geoffrey Holder's Baron Samedi. He perfectly plays the character with a tempered offering of the outrageous behavior that Samedi is known for in voodoo folklore. Plus, his being involved with the secret society of the government run by Kananga is right in line with his seedy reputation. I think the fact that he crops up throughout the film at various points and never seems to have direct involvement with the other villains during his scenes adds to his mystique and intrigue. By virtue of potentially surviving the film, he instantly sticks in people's minds like Oddjob or Jaws, and it makes a lot of sense that he'd be a popular choice for multiplayer in several Bond video games. Gloria Hendry's Rosie Carver is the weak link of the villains, but I think that's intentional. She's putting on a show for Bond at being a fairly weak operative, and I think that's a fine idea, but we never get a real look at the true persona underneath because shortly after Bond calls her out, she runs off in terror because of a scarecrow and gets killed. She never really comes into her own, and so when I think about this film or great secondary Bond women of the series, Rosie never comes to mind. David Hedison's Felix Leiter is a marked improvement from Norman Burton's. He seems like a competent fellow field agent of Bond's that just happens to be playing politics for this outing. His and Bond's chemistry might be because Hedison and Moore were friends in real life, and I think it's a shame that this is the only Moore film with Leiter. Most of the allies for the next 6 films come off as fairly forgettable with a few exceptions, and given that Moore even returns to America for a few of them, I'm curious as to why Leiter never reappeared. I'm glad that Quarrel Jr. was included in the film, and I appreciate that nothing is really made of his probable parentage. It's just a nice Easter egg for fans. Sheriff J.W. Pepper is clearly here to add more fun to the boat chase, and I do enjoy Clifton James a lot. His presence is welcome for me because the chase seems to go on for an eternity. It's filled with great moments, including one of the best stunts in Bond history, but because of the narrowness of the canals which inhibit the type of action we can have, and the fact that nobody is shooting at each other during it, I started to get fairly bored with it soon in. Finally, let's talk about the question mark of the cast, Solitaire. Jane Seymour turns in a fine performance, and I love how enigmatic she starts off being. Her regression towards being fearful after she loses her powers helps to give us a glimpse inside her head, and I appreciate that she feels like one of the more realized characters of the Bond women so far. I just wish she had a chance to redeem or reassert herself against Kananga, as she plays like more of a passive bystander through the second half of the film and doesn't contribute that much. The reason I call her a question mark is because of a couple of questions I have regarding her involvement in the story. She seems to be helping Bond after they sleep together, as she leads him to the poppy fields. Yet she turns on him at the airfield. Is she still on Bond's side and just giving him an opening? Or is she betraying him and running back to Kananga? I originally assumed that Kananga would have written her off as Bond's accomplice, so the henchmen should be surprised that she comes back over. That makes sense to me because Kananga later directly asks Bond if he slept with her, meaning that he must have suspected that Solitaire had turned by that point, and he had already found her unclear interpretations disturbing before, so he might have started to count her as a loss. But several people have commented on some of my other videos claiming that they read it as she was clearly taking advantage of the moment and helping Bond escape the airfield rather than returning to Kananga's fold. But if she's not acting on Kananga's orders, then why doesn't Kananga punish her in some way before the scene with Bond and the watch? And if he does, why don't we see or hear about it? Another question I have comes up earlier in the film. A tarot card is sent to Bond at breakfast, warning him about Rosie's true allegiance. I assume we're supposed to think that that was Solitaire, except that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Why would she be helping Bond at that point? She knows that they're meant to be lovers in the future, but she doesn't seem to want that to happen anytime soon. So what prompts her to alert Bond now? Both of these story points are hugely distracting to me, and if someone is willing to enlighten me on them, I'd highly appreciate it. When I reviewed Diamonds, I said that the production value felt like it had taken a step back from some of the earlier films, and I suspect that was due to Connery's salary. Here, the value is about the same as it was there, and yet it's less distracting. Maybe that was because the film has quite a few more action beats than Diamonds, and most of them are quite a step up, so I'm not left staring at the background as much as I did there. I already talked about my issue with the boat chase, but seriously, that stunt is remarkable. I also have to give a shout out to Bond jumping over the crocodiles. The setup is fantastic. Bond is left alone on the island with pieces of meat around him. He gets the idea to use his magnetic watch to bring over the canoe, but it's tied up. I'm so fond of this moment, by the way, because we've never really seen one of Bond's gadgets fail to get him out of a situation before. But this leads to one of the coolest things Bond has ever done, and it's a moment of movie magic. Ross Kananga, the man who owned the crocodile farm where the filmmaker shot at, volunteered to do the stunt himself, and naturally it took several tries to get it right, and some of the outtakes are breathtaking. I also love Bond's escape with Mrs. Bell at the airfield, and the small bit with Bond driving a car from the back seat. Speaking from a personal perspective, I've actually had several nightmares about being forced to drive from the backseat of a car, and I wonder if this film contributed to that at all. I feel like Guy Hamilton is putting a little more effort into this one. There are several great images throughout, and the scenes usually serve one of three things: the story, the atmosphere, or the action. In that sense, the film is much closer to Goldfinger than Diamonds. For example, there aren't as many explosions in this that typically seem to be in a Bond film, but I feel like I'd rather have great stunts throughout than save most of the action for a grand third act. The final fight between Kananga and Bond does feel muted, but the film doesn't lack for great action elsewhere, and I kinda like this change of pace from some of the other films. Not everyone needs to end with a big gunfight, and this is the first one since Russia that doesn't feature something like that in its climax. Speaking of the finale, I'm a bit disappointed that Bond's watch suddenly has a buzzsaw feature. Now, I like the idea, but it comes out in the moment, and I feel a little cheated because Bond is one step ahead of the audience here in a way that he isn't throughout much of the rest of the film. The music is an indelible part of the experience. Sir George Martin steps up to the challenge after John Barry couldn't return, and it helps the movie to feel like a declaration or a statement rather than just another verse in the long-running poem that is this series. The funky influence with the orchestra helps to give this film a color and an edge it wouldn't have had otherwise. As much as I love Barry's regular work on the series, I don't think I would have described most of his scores as being edgy, and thus he probably wouldn't have turned in as unique of a score as Martin does here. Plus, while I'll continue to rave about Majesty's and Diamond's scores, upon re-listening, I did notice that some of the tracks start to feel like they could have belonged to either film. And thus it seems like Barry was naturally starting to feel some creative fatigue after doing so many films in a short amount of time. What was probably most immensely helpful to Martin was having this excellent title track by Paul and Linda McCartney. This is one of the first songs that comes to mind when general audiences think of Bond, and I think that's entirely understandable. It became the first official Bond song to be nominated for an Oscar, and has remained one of McCartney's most well-known songs post the Beatles. There's a lot of information available about the production of this film, including an entire book written by Sir Roger Moore himself, and I think it was because the public was very interested in seeing another actor take a stab at Bond. Sure, we had Lazenby by this point, but Roger was a well-known TV presence, and many felt like it was only a matter of time before he played the role. And Roger talks very fondly of his time as 007 and has been one of the great ambassadors for the series. He even took time to record commentaries for each of his Bond films for the Ultimate Edition DVD releases, and those commentaries have carried over into subsequent releases. Do yourself a favor and listen to them if you haven't. He has a remarkable memory and is very interesting to listen to because of his more relaxed conversational way of doing these. He doesn't reveal much about the production history that you probably don't already know, but he shares fun stories and connections that he had made along the way. By the way, he says that after The Spy Who Loved Me, Live and Let Die is probably his second favorite of his run. And the rest of the world seemed to like it as well. Audiences were fairly warm towards Roger, and Live and Let Die broke a fair few records, including the record for the most watched broadcast film in the UK when it came to television in 1980. I've done a little work on looking up the box office totals for each of the Bond films and adjusting them for inflation to see where they would come up now, and I feel like that might make for an interesting topic sometime down the line. For example, Live and Let Die made $161.8 million at the time, but when you adjust that for 2023, 50 years after its debut, that would put it to just over $1 billion. The film also tends to come up when people just list Bond adventures from memory, and I think that says a lot about how it is connected with audiences. As for me, Live and Let Die is just fun to watch. It's not my favorite of the series, but it has such a feel that is remarkably different from other Bond films, and watching it in chronological order with the rest, I feel like there's a renewed sense of creativity after the play-it-safe entry that was Diamonds Are Forever. As much as I have a soft spot for all of the Bond films, there are definitely ones where you can feel that the series is going through the motions and churning out standard issue orders. That's not necessarily a problem for me because I like my standard issue Bond, but it's nice to come across one that puts in a little more effort. And yet, I wouldn't say that Live and Let Die is a top-tier film. It just tries to be a quality adventure and a great showcase of all the classic Bond elements, and it succeeds for me in that respect. Roger makes a solid debut performance here. The cast of villains is terrific, I like the feeling of danger and mystery surrounding the film, a lot of the action is genuinely good, and I always tap my toe to the soundtrack here. I just feel like it falters a bit when it comes to the finer details of the story, and bits and pieces could have been trimmed. Yet, despite this seeming success, it did not mean the Bond series was guaranteed to survive. And much like James seeing sharks behind him on the waves, Cubby and Harry had to be careful not to let their ongoing troubles sink the series beyond salvation.
My name is Bond, James Bond.
Ever since 1967, with the release of You Only Live Twice, the James Bond series had been undergoing some hard times. Despite each film being a success at the box office, they were fraught with many creative challenges and production obstacles that prevented them from soaring like they had during the Bond mania of the 1960s. And it wasn't just the fact that Sean Connery was no longer interested in playing the role. Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman's partnership was fracturing rapidly, with both men becoming irritated with the other and often competing against one another. By the time of The Man with the Golden Gun, they were trading off principal producing duties with every film, with Saltzman losing interest in the series in favor of other projects. It was Cubby's turn for Roger Moore's second outing. Even though the previous film had been the biggest hit the series had seen since Thunderball, that didn't guarantee a smooth ride to success for the next film. The Man with the Golden Gun as a book was saddled with several fundamental problems, not the least being that Ian Fleming had only finished one draft of the novel before he died in 1964, and reportedly wasn't very happy with it. So the decision was made once again to hold on to only certain aspects and characters from the novel and come up with a mostly original tale. Emboldened by the success of Live and Let Die, and under mandate from United Artists for a rapid production for another 007 film, the producers charged forward, relying on a tried and tested formula and a talented cast and crew as a launching point for what would hopefully be another success. James Bond is sent a golden bullet, inscribed with his 00 number. MI6 theorizes that the renowned hitman Francisco Scaramanga, aka the Man with the Golden Gun, is gunning for Bond, and that he should go to ground until Scaramanga is either caught or killed. Not content to lay low, Bond sets off to follow the manufacturing trail of the bullet, starting in Beirut, and eventually tracing the delivery of the bullets to Scaramanga's girlfriend, Andrea Anders. After a near run-in with Scaramanga at a nightclub, Bond deduces that he is not the one being hunted, as Scaramanga had ample opportunity to take him out there, and instead killed a scientist who was working on a new solution to the global energy crisis. Intrigued by this mystery, Bond continues to pursue the assassin and the energy solution, knowing that he is going up against a man who is quite possibly his equal in almost every way. Much like several other Bond films, The Man with the Golden Gun takes inspiration from contemporary real-world events. There really was an energy crisis in 1973, fueled by the oil embargo from the Arabian Peninsula towards supporters of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, which included the United Kingdom. And this left several countries in a financial pickle. I think this was added to the script as the central tale from Tom Mankiewicz of Bond being hunted by Scaramanga is intriguing, but might not have been developed enough or exciting enough on its lonesome to carry a whole movie. I can kind of see where the filmmakers are coming from, though I firmly believe that with a little embellishment, a hunt would have been a fascinating change of pace for Bond. From Rush with Love wasn't too far off from this idea, with Red Grant shadowing Bond at every turn. And other films aptly prove there is enough excitement and tension to be gleaned from a fox hunt. The Day of the Jackal in 1973, 3 Days of the Condor in 1975, or Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest are good examples of people being hunted from the shadows. Or you could have focused the film on a duel between the Titans like in the climax, Bond and Scaramanga actively going against each other. Instead, The Man with the Golden Gun feels like just another adventure with Bond doing another investigation which leads to the bad guy who has another grand plan. It's fine, but it doesn't feel like the creators are taking many risks here, nor are they offering a polished version of the standard formula. So it feels like the creators are just going through the motions since they didn't have the time or the inspiration to do something truly special. And it feels like the filmmakers themselves were aware of their own creative juices being run dry this time around. Guy Hamilton, Tom Mankiewicz, and others all sound a little burnt out in interviews and retrospectives when talking about this movie, and they're borderline apologetic about certain things. Cubby has said before that he wouldn't have wanted to remake any of the films, but that there were some things about Golden Gun he wasn't satisfied with. I think part of the problem is the insanely rushed production. This film came out 18 months after Live and Let Die. But also that the film exudes a lack of direction and purpose behind its structure. The film starts off with an intriguing setup of Bond seemingly being hunted. And then it takes a turn towards investigating the murder of Gibson, the Solex expert, dropping that setup entirely. It then comes back around to catching up with Scaramanga, finishing off with a duel and retrieving the Solex almost like an afterthought. The movie seems to oscillate drastically between the two stories, and thus it doesn't have a strong motivation behind much of its narrative choices, resulting in neither plot having both a satisfying build-up and payoff. I think the film watches okay if you're not concerned with a solid logical sequence of events, and I'm not always when I'm watching an action movie, but even making that concession, a lot of the flick feels tepid in its choices. Take its action, for example. The best bit is the corkscrew stunt with Bond's AMC Hornet, but that is really the standout of a rather routine car chase featuring yet more comedic crashes involving the police. Third in a row, by the way. Though an out-of-place Sheriff Pepper tries to liven it up. Elsewhere, you have an okay fight in a cabaret club in Beirut, the martial arts school scene and subsequent boat chase which screams, "Hey, Enter the Dragon was popular, let's try some of that," and a final fight between Bond and Knick-Knack. There's hardly anything here to get your blood pumping or that's filled with cool visuals. There's definitely germs of good ideas here, but nothing comes off as more than serviceable. And a lot of the dialogue-heavy scenes aren't that interesting enough on their own, and thus I find watching the film to be one of the duller experiences of the series. I'm sure part of that is the mixed bag of performances here. Roger Moore seems to be doing something different than what he had established in the previous film. He's darker, harsher, and lacking in any true charm or sophistication, a cold-hearted bastard without the debonair. He's far more unlikable than Bond has ever been in this series. Within seconds, he treats Mary Goodnight like a nuisance when she hasn't really done anything yet to merit that treatment. He's condescending to her when she gets mad about him not sleeping with her. He's quite cruel with Andrea in her hotel room. Especially with Roger being the one doing these scenes, it's uncomfortable to watch, and Moore admits to being uncomfortable when he did these scenes in his commentary. The performance here has been compared with Connery's take on the character, which I think there is some validity to, but it just goes to show why only Connery can do Connery Bond well, and everyone else should just be doing their own thing. Sean could slap a woman around and then get her into bed without coming across as a complete jerk. I really can't see any other Bond actor getting away with the same thing. Certainly not Roger. It'd be a bit like if Peter Davidson or Matt Smith tried to copy their acclaimed predecessors in Doctor Who. It would have proved a disaster. Davidson and Smith work best when they do their own thing, and same with Moore here. Now, he can play a less jovial Bond if given the right material, and I think he accomplishes that very well in later installments, but if I ever tried to rank individual Bond performances, I'm sure Moore's in this film would come towards the bottom. Britt Ekland as Mary Goodnight seems to be like a good choice on the casting side of things. She can be fun and energetic, and during the first half of the film, I'm really liking her character. However, when she comes to Bond's hotel room after playing hard to get, she instantly loses the goodwill I had towards her. That scene in particular makes it clear that she was just thirsty for Bond the whole time, and that the hard to get act was simply a kind of foreplay, which makes me write her off as a bimbo. Whenever we come back to her and Bond in a scene, the topic seems to keep returning to the question of when is he going to sleep with her. Granted, we as an audience probably have this in the back of our minds from the get-go, but seeing a character that seems to have an almost fourth wall-like awareness of her status as the sexual object, and making that a primary motivation for her character is unsettling. Maud Adams as Andrea Anders fares much better, which is weird because she is the sex object for both Bond and Scaramanga. She's the one I feel the most sympathy for since she is trapped in a horrible situation and pleading for any escape since she is living a lifeless existence. This is a great idea that would be refined in later films, especially with Severine and Skyfall. But this film seems to toss the interesting notion aside almost immediately because less than 5 minutes after we learn her true part in the story, she's shot and quickly forgotten about. It's tragic, but not in the way I think the film intends. I would have liked it if Bond maybe mentioned her after he kills Scaramanga or brought her up during the dinner scene, making it clear that she actually matters to the overall story, kind of like how Bond brings up Paris to Elliot Carver in Tomorrow Never Dies. Bond's allies are also quite strange this time out. M's completely pissed off in most of the film with none of the crusty charm that Bernard Lee had had in the other films, and it becomes very one-note. Tanner, Colthorpe, and Fraser are all pointless extra characters that add little to their respective scenes. Lieutenant Hip is one of the blandest of Bond's allies, and I'll never forgive him for leaving Bond at the martial arts school. The one who comes out okay is Q, and this is where I become convinced that Desmond Llewellyn can do no wrong in this series. By this point, he had become a firm favorite, and no matter which installment I'm watching, I'm always happy to get to his scenes. Now that we've gone through the good guys, can we talk about the fantastic pair of villains we have here? Christopher Lee makes for one of the best in the series, and it's not because he's delivering an okay performance amongst mediocrity. He makes Scaramanga way more interesting than he is on the page. He's got all the right measurements of charm and darkness in his cocktail of a performance that Bond's missing from his. I desperately wish he was in one of the better films. Could you imagine the dinner conversation with someone like Connery or Dalton on the other side of the table? It'd be a powerhouse scene. The phrases that come to mind when I think of Lee here are inspired choice and born for this role. I feel like I don't need to convince you that Lee was one of our finest actors, and I'm so glad he did agree to be in one of these films. And to his credit, Lee often recalled his time on this film with fondness. It's often brought up that he was Ian Fleming's cousin and could have been the inspiration for Bond. There's some credence to that, though I doubt he was the whole inspiration for the character. It's just a pleasure to have him here livening up the film. Hervé Villechaize is also fantastic here. Guy Hamilton said he wanted to do the opposite of Oddjob with Nick Nack, and I'm surprised that until I came across that statement, I never once connected the two. Nick Nack feels like a unique character, partly due to his interesting relationship with Scaramanga. It's almost a friendly antagonistic one, where Nick Nack keeps bringing in people to try to kill Scaramanga so he can get his fortune, and yet he never really shows open hostility towards his boss, and gladly helps him out with a lot of his schemes, partly by acting as the all-seeing eyes during the funhouse bits. It reminds me a bit of Proxy from the Force Unleashed games, and makes for a truly charming character. The one bit where I think they dropped the ball on him a bit is with the ending. In true Guy Hamilton fashion, there is one last fight with Bond right before the credits roll. Nick Nack uses his size to help him out, but Bond fairly easily overcomes him, and coupled with the music choice, there's no tension here like there was in the other three Hamilton pictures, with their respective villains coming back to kill Bond. I feel like the filmmakers thought Nick Nack was going to be inherently funny, and played him as a bit of a joke. While there is a lot that is humorous about Nick Nack, I never associate him with broader comedy, and I have no doubt he could indeed be a challenge to Bond with the right hands guiding the film. High Fat is a nothing character to me. I don't like or dislike him. He functions fine, and he's a major player in the Solex plot until he gets offed, but he doesn't really offer much beyond that. I am, however, curious as to why Bond never tries to go back to High Fat's place after the martial arts scene. He says that further inquiries about Fat are brushed off. Okay, but then does he not think that there's something fishy going on here? Does he think that the connection is a dead end that's not worth exploring in person? If so, he's incredibly lucky that Anders comes back with an actual lead. Otherwise, I doubt Bond would have found Scaramanga. There are two other minor characters that I like, Chula and Lazar. I always thought Chula would have made for an interesting villainous wrinkle if they actually used him beyond the one scene, and I think I like Lazar mostly for the one scene that he's in. The writing in this film is just for function a lot of the time, but there are several great moments of acting throughout, and this scene features Moore's best line. The rest of the production is perfectly fine. This is the first Bond film to have neither Ken Adam or Sid Cain doing production design duties, and Peter Merton is a suitable replacement. I'm particularly impressed with his slanted Queen Elizabeth set. Oswald Morris takes over cinematography duties from Ted Moore partway through the production, and I'm impressed that I had a hard time spotting the difference between the two styles. John Barry does a fine job with the score, given that there were only 3 weeks to deliver it, so it makes sense that the Bond theme and main title song get plenty of usage here. Speaking of the title song, I know it ranks fairly low with most fans, and I did rank it in a lower tier in my title songs ranking, but that doesn't mean I can't get some enjoyment from it. I think it's trying to strike a middle ground between Shirley Bassey and Paul McCartney, and while that idea muddies it up and makes it a bit unappealing, especially with some unusually poor lyrics from Don Black, I'd be lying if I said the song doesn't make me groove along with it a bit. The standout design elements are related to Scaramanga, the Golden Gun, and the island. I always really liked the idea that the Golden Gun was made out of several unassuming common items, and that gives it a unique shape and look. It's become one of the most iconic props of the series, and for good reason. I also love Scaramanga's island. Beautifully showcasing Ka Ping Kan Island, it makes for an exotic retreat and is the kind of place I'd hide out in if I had my pick of locations. Plus, the funhouse is a wonderful idea. It serves as a training ground for an elite assassin that doesn't play fair with his opponents. It's like going over to a friend's house to play a game you don't own. Your friend has the home field advantage, and it's not really an honest contest. For that reason, I'm quite bummed that the scene we saw in the original teaser trailer got cut. It proves Scaramanga is a cheater and really adds to the character. There's a sense of incompleteness about this film to me. Some things are padded out, some things are dropped unceremoniously, and others come out of left field. I've already mentioned a few, like Bond not following up with High Fat after the martial arts school scene, or Hip leaving Bond behind there, but those aren't the only culprits. The scene where Hip takes Bond out to the Queen Elizabeth is overly long and unnecessary. I get that the MI6 base is out a ways from the city, but I don't understand why we need the tension of Hip's allegiance. Can't he just tell him about it when they get in the car or on the boat before Bond literally jumps ship? I get that Scaramanga is greedy, and that's why he continues the Solex scheme, but I'm curious as to why he feels confident enough about it to set up shop on his own island. He seems like a man who doesn't own what he feels he can't control, and the idea that Scaramanga doesn't understand the science enough but continues the scheme anyways feels incongruous with his character to me. Finally, there's the duel at the end. Let me just say that I love almost everything about this climax. It's low-key, tense, wonderfully disorienting, and it's satisfying to see Bond beat Scaramanga at his own game. Yet I'm a little confused with the beat with Bond swapping places with the mannequin. How does he do that without alerting Scaramanga, who's in the same room? Also, Bond loses his pistol underneath the funhouse. Does he just go down to grab it, climb all the way back up, and swap places with the mannequin? Or does he just leave the gun down there? If he doesn't take the time to go get it, where does he get the new gun? You can't tell me that the gun that was in the mannequin's hand is a real loaded gun to begin with. I love the idea of the switch, but it feels too contrived the way it plays out on screen. The Man with the Golden Gun is one of those entries where you can never predict how someone else is going to feel about it right off the bat. I've seen some fans that sincerely put this one as a top-tier film, and I know plenty of others that stick it towards the bottom. I've had similar differing viewpoints in the past. When I was a kid and just getting into Bond, this was actually the first Roger Moore film that I saw all the way through, and it was one of the first I ever purchased on DVD. I liked it a lot at the time, but I've slowly changed my tune since then. I know there's a really dedicated fan base for this one, and I can't totally dislike it. But once I had seen the rest of the series and really had time to digest them all, I found that Golden Gun just wasn't one that I wanted to return to all that much. It's got really fantastic things about it, like most every Bond film, but it's pretty dull throughout most of the runtime, and that lack of energy means I have to be in just the right mood for it. There are plenty of Rogers films like The Spy Who Loved Me or Octopussy that I'm always up for watching, but The Man with the Golden Gun can put me to sleep if I'm not careful. The film was less successful than its predecessor in almost every way. Most critics noted the step down in quality, and several expressed that they felt like the series was losing steam. It also unfortunately marked the last time that Cubby and Harry were co-producers on a Bond film. Due to several factors unrelated to the production, Harry left the partnership shortly after its release, and Cubby became the sole producer of the series moving forward. With Roger approaching the final film in his initial 3-film contract, Cubby was determined to make the next one a resounding success unlike any they had had since the Connery days, and prove that Bond could still make a splash with audiences 15 years after his cinematic debut.
My name is Bond. James Bond.
I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of unique experiences with films, and I often find second viewings a requirement before I feel strong enough to give my thoughts on a project. The reason for that is that I find a lot of first viewings misleading. I might be gawking at the spectacle of the piece that I miss a lot of the subtler story points, or there might be extra layers that only reveal themselves upon a second viewing. I might have expectations that the film doesn't meet, which leads me to hate the film because I wanted it to be something else rather than accepting it for what it is. I didn't immediately love the original Jaws upon first viewing. I was expecting something drenched in atmosphere and horror, but because of that, I missed a lot of what the film was doing, and with many viewings behind me and with a clearer perspective, I now consider it to be one of the few cinematic masterpieces in existence. I saw Return of the King in the theaters before I saw any of the other films, and thus it was a miserable and draining experience as I had little knowledge of what was going on, and I couldn't appreciate the massive payoff it was both emotionally and in scale to the first two acts of this gigantic story. Obviously, I know better now. And there are plenty of Bond films that underwent similar processes. Goldfinger is a big example. I thought it was a really solid film, but I didn't understand the almost manic love some fans have for it. Over time, I came to appreciate the film more and more, even if it still isn't my favorite of the series. And The Spy Who Loved Me is another great example. I never disliked it, I just thought it was solid. Nothing more, nothing less. And I initially wrote it off as yet another standard Bond adventure. Almost 20 years later, it's a firm top 10 entry for me. Oh, it's not perfect, and I'll get into my issues with it, and it's not even my favorite Roger Moore Bond adventure. However, I think it's the perfect encapsulation of all that era did well, and thus it's the best Moore film in that sense. It's got an amazing balance of fun and new ideas blended with the old, yet it is its own flavor. Spy was the film where the series really stopped living in the shadow of Sean Connery's reign and fully emerged as a franchise that was bigger than any one man for the public. Though that's despite several solid films that were released after 1967. The Spy Who Loved Me came after the longest hiatus the series had seen at that point. 2.5 years had passed since the release of The Man with the Golden Gun, and about a year of that time was spent in dispute. Harry Saltzman ran into various financial problems due to his other ventures outside James Bond, and the losses couldn't be made up by any one successful picture. In one of his many efforts to get out of debt, Saltzman placed his shares of Danjaq, the company holding the production rights to Bond, as collateral against various loans. One of those companies attempted to realize the investment by trying to force the sale of his shares. Beyond that, Saltzman had blocked the production of Spy in retaliation for Cubby Broccoli not allowing funds to be moved by Harry from Danjaq. This put the company in a bit of a bind. Time was running out, and the contract specified that if a new production didn't begin soon, United Artists would be able to option the series to another company, and thus Danjaq would lose the rights to the very franchise it was created for. Eventually, Saltzman caved and sold his shares to United Artists, who became partners with Cubby in order to continue producing Bond films. As the sole credited producer of James Bond, Cubby was determined to make the best film possible. Plenty of writers offered drafts and suggestions, including Cary Bates, Jerry Anderson, John Landis, and Anthony Burgess. Eventually, the script was authored by veteran Bond writer Richard Maybaum and newcomer to the series Christopher Wood, with uncredited help from Tom Mankiewicz and Vernon Harris. With Guy Hamilton going off with the Salkinds to be the initial director of Superman the movie, Louis Gilbert returned to direct his second Bond film. Originally, the movie was going to feature the return of Blofeld and Spectre, but Kevin McClory came in and put a stop to that, since he was in the pre-production stages of his own rival Bond film, which eventually resulted in Never Say Never Again. Other fantastic people came to work on this film, including newcomers like cinematographer Claude Renoir and composer Marvin Hamlish, and some returning favorites like production designer Ken Adam, editor John Glenn, and Willie Bogner Jr. to come in and shoot the ski sequence. 2 nuclear submarines have been hijacked, one from the British and one from the Russians. Both had nuclear missiles on board, and it seems to be the result of a new submarine tracking system, which is to be placed for sale to the highest bidder. As a result, the Russians send their best agent, Agent XXX, and of course, MI6 sends out James Bond. Working opposite ends of the case, the two meet up in Cairo to find Max Kalba, the seller of the microfilm. But before the sale begins, Kalba is killed by a mercenary named Jaws, who steals the microfilm. Bond and Anya eventually recover it and deduce that Karl Stromberg, one of the richest men in the world, is responsible for this scheme. Under orders from both of their governments, the two join forces officially and head to Sardinia in order to discover Stromberg's plans, which will ultimately result in a global Armageddon which has the potential to destroy all of civilization. On paper, the end goal and much of the details of this plot seem distilled from previous Bond adventures, especially Gilbert's own You Only Live Twice. But ultimately, none of this matters to me. I've said many times before that I am not a stickler for originality in plots, particularly with Bond. The reason is because filmmakers have other tools at their disposal, and there are more ingredients to a film than its story. If the film is entertaining enough through its other elements, what do I care if I've seen a lot of this before? That's the main reason I'm fine with films like Star Trek IX and The Force Awakens. Both are supremely entertaining and offer plenty of delicious things for me to chew on, and it is absolutely the same with Spy. Beyond the plot, you have Roger delivering one of the finest Bond performances in the series, a leading lady who absolutely measures up to the hero, one of the most iconic and best henchmen in all of cinema, perhaps the best pre-title sequence of the series, one of the best cars ever, beautiful photography by Renoir, and a sense of tongue-in-cheek fun and irreverence that we've not seen in this series since Goldfinger. The film does run a little long at times, but I can easily forgive it because I've had such a great ride throughout. Louis Gilbert is a director that's very hit and miss for me. Out of his 3 Bond pictures, this is my favorite, and it's not even like it's a close competition. Gilbert correctly identifies one of the major problems the series had been suffering from. Connery's shadow loomed large over the films, and each entry was trying to treat the issue with more attention and caution than it really deserved. Live and Let Die tried to avoid direct comparisons when possible, Golden Gun tried to imitate him, Majesty's just pretended as if Connery never left, and Diamonds brought him back. Spy says, screw that, let's just make the best film possible with the pieces we have, and if people make comparisons with Sean, that's their business. Now that's an attitude I can get behind. The film brings over all that has been good about Bond in the past, tailors it for Roger so he can flourish, and makes sure that none of it can be taken too seriously. It's not so campy that there can't be more serious and tension-filled moments, but we are squarely in the realm of spy fantasy for this one, so pass the popcorn and let's have a great time. Roger Moore had already delivered some great foundational work for his take on the character with Live and Let Die, but this is where he really comes into focus. And it's a trend I've seen with the series. The third film is where the actor really cements his era and feels the most comfortable, for better or for worse. Spy has a more jovial Bond whose duty to country always comes first, who can take his job and the ramifications of it seriously, but always enjoys the finer parts of it where he can. He's such a charismatic lead here that it's hard not to want to be around him or even to be him. He's got quips galore, charm aplenty with the ladies, composure and focus where it's most demanded, and style all around. It's no wonder while watching the film that many fans consider him to be their preferred Bond. Beyond the fun parts, Roger gets to flex his acting muscles a bit with some of the quieter moments. The standout is the scene in the hotel with Anya where he frankly talks about death and why he's not shying away from taking a life when it's necessary. But I also love that this is the first film to explicitly acknowledge Tracy's death in a very understated moment that has such great line delivery from Moore. Anya Amasova is one of the most notable female companions of the series. She's a great match for Bond on most every level, and I enjoy their friendly banter with each other. Plus, the ticking time bomb of the reveal of Bond having killed her boyfriend adds a critical element of tension. I do have a few problems with her, and they might just be me things. First, I find her line readings flat and emotionless a lot of the time. It's not that the voice doesn't match the character, it just feels lifeless, which detracts from various moments. Second, I think it's easy to forget the boyfriend thing until it's brought up again pretty late in the film, which is a shame because it's a fresh idea for a Bond relationship. I'm not exactly sure how to fix it without making it feel a little overbearing, but I feel like it's something that could have enriched their scenes. And lastly, her being kidnapped and largely absent from the third act deflates much of that build-up with her. For a character as resourceful as she is, it's a mistake to have her in exactly the same spot that Stromberg left her tied up when Bond finds her. I'm not saying that he shouldn't have gone to Atlantis to look for her and that she should have just rescued herself, but I think she could have pulled her weight a bit in the climax, much like Wei Lin does in Tomorrow Never Dies or Madeline in No Time to Die. I'll repeat a notion I expressed in the Bond women ranking. On paper, she's clearly one of the best women of the series, but in practice, she's not allowed to flourish like she could have. Karl Stromberg is played by Kurt Jürgens, a respectable choice who does fine with the role, but the choice to make him an overlord that doesn't do much of his own dirty work hurts his standing as a Bond villain. Plus, he doesn't have as much presence as he should. I think this is more a writing issue than anything, and while he's not a bad villain, he's a notable weak link in the cast. However, the same cannot be said for Jaws. What could I possibly say about this guy that hasn't already been said? He's menacing, he's got a memorable gimmick, and there's an element of fun about him that doesn't undermine his more terrifying qualities. At least, not in this film. Richard Kiel towers over everyone else, and he becomes an unstoppable force that seems invincible, so you can only dispatch of him for a short time before he comes around again. One of my favorite images in the film is when he grabs Bond by the jaw on the train. His hand is almost the size of Bond's head, and it's a powerful way to communicate how dangerous he is whenever he shows up. Your best physical blows do little to deter him. Nature doesn't seem to stop him, and so you must use your own intelligence to delay him. It's a fantastic character, and what's interesting to me is that he is the sole element that can be traced back to the original novel. The Spy Who Loved Me is often regarded as one of the worst Ian Fleming books, even by Fleming himself, and thus he seemed to do all he could to bury it from people's memories upon release. Yet Cubby always loved the title, and thus while trying to stay completely away from the story of the book, he took what he felt he could get away with to create a mostly original film, and I say original in quotes. Adapting horror into Jaws was one of the best moves the series ever made, and we as a fan base remain forever grateful. There are quite a few memorable side players here. This film kind of started a rotating B cast which would continue for about a decade, and I feel like this was a great way to firmly flesh out this universe. Jeffrey Keane makes his first appearance as Defense Minister Frederick Gray. He's clearly here to add another voice to the mission briefings, but he does it so well that I don't mind his presence. Walter Gotell, returning from Russia with Love, introduces us to a new character, General Gogol, who I feel is one of the most overlooked characters in the series. It makes sense that there would be an opposite number to M for the Soviets, and I love that he's sometimes in opposition to Bond, while at other times he's a clear ally. I'd never label him as an outright villain, but he's a sign of Cubby's willingness to make sure that the Russians weren't always the bad guys, and I'm grateful for that. Beyond that, there are a lot of fun cameos and small parts here. George Baker, for example, who returns from Majesty's but in another role. Admiral Hargreaves, played by Robert Brown, who would go on to take the role of M from Bernard Lee eventually. Milton Reed, who appeared in both Dr. No and Casino Royale from 1967, plays Sondor, his meatiest part. A blink-and-you-miss-it appearance from Jeremy Bulloch, who would later reappear as Smithers, one of Q's assistants in the later films, and who is probably most noteworthy for playing Boba Fett from the original Star Wars trilogy. Caroline Munro, who had a minor part in Casino Royale 67, plays an actual memorable character in Naomi, though she's strangely dubbed by Barbara Jefford, who also dubbed Tanya in From Russia with Love. Michael Billington, who seemed to be forever in the running to actually playing Bond, plays Anya's boyfriend from the pre-titles, and Charles Gray makes his third contribution to the series by providing the voiceover narration for the pyramid scene. But by far my favorite B-cast member here is Shane Rimmer, who plays the American naval captain, Commander Carter. A Canadian actor who voiced Scott Tracy in the original Thunderbirds, he's a bit player in many great films, and I always delight in seeing him. He's been in so many things, like Dr. Strangelove, Gandhi, Out of Africa, Star Wars, Superman 2 and 3, and Batman Begins. Spy is only one of several Bond films he did. He plays uncredited roles in You Only Live Twice, Diamonds Are Forever, and apparently voices someone in Live and Let Die. But I adore seeing him get something more prominent here, and he makes for a great ally to Bond during the third act. I don't feel like Shane ever got the recognition he deserved, but I wanted to give him a shout out here. Most everything about this movie's presentation works for me. Claude Renoir joins the series and helps to make Spy one of the best looking Bonds ever. Plus, I really appreciate the return to a wider aspect ratio for the series. The amount of great shots in this film is staggering, particularly from the title sequence, which is definitely one of Maurice Binder's best. Seriously, do yourself a favor and rewatch it. It's astounding work. John Glenn's editing is much improved from Majesty's. He allows scenes to play out and doesn't artificially inject anything into the film that doesn't feel natural, which I feel like he and Hunt sometimes had a tendency to do there. Ken Adams' contribution to the film is another unparalleled triumph. Thanks to this film, a brand new soundstage was created at Pinewood Studios known as the 007 stage, which has been home to many grand sets for a long list of films. The action is also pretty good, perhaps the best since Majesty's. The ski jump is such a crowd-pleasing moment that it brings the house down every time. The battle in the supertanker I personally feel improves on the large-scale battles from previous Bonds. Bond's Kill the Sondor is one of my favorite colder bits from Moore. But perhaps the most memorable part is with the Lotus Esprit. The first worthy successor car to the Aston Martin DB5, it's become part of pop culture in a similar, if somewhat lesser way. I've personally never been a fan of its angular design, but that's against the manufacturer, not the film. And besides, who cares when it's got all of these cool toys? I've been working on a Bond vehicle's ranking video for some time now, and at the risk of spoiling a little bit about it, you can bet the Lotus will be pretty high up there. By now, you may get the impression that I have fewer problems with this movie than I really do, since I've been mostly gushing about it. However, let's get into a big criticism that I have with the film, which again is just another personal gripe: the music. I don't really hate it, but I don't really love it either. I think it works better when watching the film than it does outside of it, which is a real bummer. I love listening to Bond soundtracks, but Spy is rarely one I stick in, beyond two songs, Bond 77 and Nobody Does It Better. Bond 77 is an unusual presentation of the Bond theme that grows on you like crazy. Once I got over the fact that it largely stays away from the main Bond theme for much of its runtime, I can't help but groove to a lot of it. It also strongly reintroduces the guitar into the theme, which I'm a huge fan of, and it gets some great moments in the film, such as Bond riding the camera in the La Paris or when he skis backwards in the pre-titles. Nobody Does It Better is also a fantastic song, which has become one of the series' signature ballads, with perhaps one of the best phrases that it's ever offered. My issue with it is somewhat circumstantial. It gets overplayed a lot. Every time there's a retrospective of the series or a Bond actor, I feel like the song is the immediate choice, and I do start to get sick of it. It becomes sappy and feels like cheap nostalgia when it's overused like that, and I still have a hard time dismissing those feelings when I hear it. It's a great song, don't get me wrong, but can we please bridle our impulses to use it so frequently and impulsively? Overexposure is a concept that ruins things, and this series has so many other great softer songs that could serve similar purposes. The issues I have with the actual score itself within the film are mostly due to the synth. Synth is such a hard thing to get right because it can either sound really fresh and sharp, or it sounds dull and cheap. As far as I can tell, there's no consistency with how people are going to feel about synth, least of all myself. I adore its use in For Your Eyes Only, though I've encountered plenty of people who are quick to point out they hate that score. Spy unfortunately sounds cheap and dull to me a lot of the time, especially during the Ride to Atlantis bit. Furthermore, I'm split on the placement of music within scenes. It takes great skill not only to know when to play music, but what kind of music to play. A great example of this is Jerry Goldsmith's score to the original Planet of the Apes film. If almost anyone else did that movie, I feel like we would have gotten a fairly traditional orchestral score, but Goldsmith uses atonal and strangely atypical music for a sci-fi film, and it makes such an impression. Plus, he intelligently keeps music out of some of the most dramatic scenes, like the final scene with Heston on the beach. Sometimes the music in Spy feels intrusive to me. I'm not a fan of the upbeat male version of the title song at the end, for instance. though I get the gag with the curtains dropping. Plus, while I love some of the non-original music that plays throughout, like in the reveal of Atlantis, I personally have a hard time with the choice to play Lawrence of Arabia's theme over Bond and Anya's walking through the desert. I get the joke, and it is as unintrusive as it possibly could be, but unless the film is a straight parody or farce, I really resist using popular film music like that within the dramatic score. Can you imagine if a film tried to do something like that today? See, it's distracting to me. Those are my main gripes about the score, but there are many other moments that do work really well for me, and I've mentioned a few already, such as the bits with Bond 77 or the pyramid scene with Jaws. The Spy Who Loved Me stands as one of the pinnacles of the series for a lot of Bond fans, although that's not as universal a love as with some of the other films. Part of that is because the audience's tastes has shifted over time. And especially during Daniel Craig's run, a lot of us returned to the more low-key adventures and found much to love there. The audience's perceptions of From Russia with Love, Majesty's Secret Service, and the Dalton films benefited from Craig's tenure. And some of that has shifted the spotlight from Spy towards For Your Eyes Only. I love both films, and I'm particularly partial to Eyes, but Spy has been one that I have found more reason to return to in the last decade or so. Maybe it's because I too got a little sick of the more downbeat and somber tones of big budget films for a while, and Spy retains such a sense of merriment that acts as an antidote to the more involving films of the series. I love my meaty Casino Royales, Majesties, or License to Kills, but sometimes I need a shot of fructose like Tomorrow Never Dies, Octopussy, or The Spy Who Loved Me in my palate. Whenever I do Bond film rankings, I find that this and Goldfinger often compete for the same spot, and I go back and forth about which one I prefer. Goldfinger won last round, but it never beats down Spy for long, and I think it speaks to the fact that it is almost as essential a definer for the series as the other. If you want to get a newcomer into the series and they stubbornly insist on only watching one film, I find this, Goldfinger, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale to be my rotating four to pick from. They are great time capsules of all that Bond was in a particular era, and thus you have to gauge the person asking for what they might best respond to if you intend to get them hooked on this series. The Spy Who Loved Me had a long-reaching impact within the series as well as pop culture. The film premiered on July 7, 1977, and as Patrick McNee states in a documentary, 7777 turns out to be a very lucky date for 007. It's one of the favorites of many Bond alumni, including Cubby, Michael G. Wilson, and Roger Moore. It also seemed to establish a template for Bond adventures that would be followed through the rest of Roger's run. 1977 was a great year at the movies for audiences, and some of the other successes of that year would go on to shape a new craze for film that many tried to latch onto, particularly Bond. When you have a picture as gargantuan and successful as Spy, where does it seem like you can go but up?
Yes, my name is Bond. James Bond.
Film companies often look to recent hits in order to determine their path forward. This is a fine strategy to pursue, as film studios are businesses first and creative places second. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all imitators of this new kid in town can't be worthwhile as well. There have been trends of westerns, musicals, gangster films, spy films, and plenty of others, and these are just results of an evolving industry. For example, when Die Hard came out, everyone pivoted towards everyday men as action heroes rather than the buff macho men of Schwarzenegger, and many subsequent films were called Die Hard on a Plane, Die Hard on a Cliff, or Die Hard on a Bus. In 2008, we had the dual successes of Iron Man and The Dark Knight that quickly led to an oversaturation of superhero films, though much like with the Die Hard trend, several really great efforts came out of this rush. In the late 1970s, sci-fi films were coming back in a big way. This was heralded by the earlier successes of the Planet of the Apes films and 2001: A Space Odyssey, but 1977 really clinched it, with both the original Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind doing big business. Further sci-fi films followed, some of which were in production before these earlier two's release dates, including Superman the Movie, Alien, Blade Runner, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Buck Rogers of the 25th Century, and H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come. Originally, the plan for James Bond was to do a film titled For Your Eyes Only, but United Artists and Cubby Broccoli shifted gears towards the space-sounding title of Moonraker and crafted a film that endeavored to top the successful The Spy Who Loved Me in every conceivable way in order to capitalize on this latest movement. A British airplane carrying the Moonraker shuttle crashes in the Yukon, but MI6 finds no sign of the Moonraker within the wreckage. Puzzled, they send James Bond out to Drax Industries to confront the CEO about this enigma. Bond quickly finds that there is more going on than a hijacked shuttle, finding remnants of tech documents that point to major production locations in Venice and Rio. Bond goes to each in turn to discover what Drax may be planning, while being shadowed by two henchmen of his, Chang, a martial arts master, and the towering Jaws returning from the previous film. He also finds that there is a CIA mole within Drax Industries named Dr. Holly Goodhead. Working with her, they discover a secret shuttle launching base in the Amazon. In order to stop Drax, the two must follow him even into the coldest reaches of space to prevent global destruction. The original novel is one of Ian Fleming's very best works, and it's surprising they still had that title left to go through given that they were about to start using the titles of the short stories. The filmmakers retained much of the crew from Spy and set about creating an original tale. I'm very much of two minds about this choice. On the one hand, Cubby was right in that trying to adapt the book's plot about a rocket destroying London in the 70s would have been seen as a poor escalation from Spy, whose villain tried to destroy the world. If your direction is to surprise and delight audiences, going bigger in scale is a viable option, and at this point, emboldened by the success of Spy, it seemed like a valid way to go. Plus, the series has already teased the idea of going into space before, with You Only Live Twice coming within shooting distance of the notion. On the other hand, this is one of the more lazily constructed plots in the series. It's fairly obvious that they're pretty much copying major beats from Spy, which in itself borrowed elements from Twice. Now, that's not really a big problem for me. My issue is that the story is being driven by the needs of the formula rather than the characters. Bond only ends up in each major location by breadcrumbs he found in the previous location. He is led to Venice by a document showing Venetian glass vials. He then goes to Rio because of a company shipping stamp on a box. He heads to the Amazon because the gas's formula is derived from a native plant. When he goes to the Amazon, he has no idea what he will find or if Drax is even there. If Jaws and crew hadn't tried to kill him, Bond might have been too late to stop Drax. But even after that, he only finds the base because one of Drax's girls is provocatively leading him there. I feel like the connecting tissue of the story is razor thin. He goes to a location because the story needs him to. Other Bond films have this problem to a degree, but Moonraker is the biggest offender of this that I can think of. Beyond that, the film tries to employ the same tongue-in-cheek tone from the past film, and it ends up not really either being charming or funny. The script just doesn't have the wit from before, and a lot of the humorous bits fall flat or are ridiculously silly. Jaws being played more for laughs, having a girlfriend shorter than him that somehow doesn't have braces, a gondola in St. Mark's Square with all the reactions from the crowd, the musical in-jokes. It all ends up feeling like the movie is trying too hard to go for an objective marker on some imaginary board to success rather than feeling natural. It's a movie that feels very mechanical in its construction, and aside from its grand scale, it comes dangerously close to feeling like just another random, uninspired film in the series. Granted, Bond is a very formulaic series, and you could accuse plenty of other films like Octopussy or Tomorrow Never Dies of being very standard. And you'd be right. A Bond film doesn't have to be at the forefront of innovation to be enjoyable, but it does need to have some spice to it, which I could cite those films as having. Moonraker just feels bland for much of its runtime, and thus it's not one that I ever really go back to. Roger Moore is consistently fun in most of his films, and he brings that same consistency here. I do think his shtick of one-upping people in his random knowledge gets overplayed a bit, but Moore is doing his best to have fun with the material. He doesn't get as many opportunities to play the cooler side of the character, but I don't mind him going for charm over danger. My favorite bit, though, is one of the few moments where he does get to play cool. During the shooting scene with Drax, he deliberately misses a bird and hits a camouflaged assassin in a nearby tree. It reminds me a lot of the gag in Thunderball where Bond casually shoots the target while being so natural, as it elicits the same response from me. Gosh, he's just so cool, isn't he? There's a couple of fun one-liners here and there, but most don't feel as sharp as before, and I do think there's an overabundance of them. Lois Chiles as Dr. Holly Goodhead is very much a character in the same boat as Anya Masova from the previous film. She's a fellow agent working on the opposite side of the investigation, she's just as capable as Bond, she has a somewhat frosty and hostile relationship with him early on, and she gets kidnapped by the main villain. Thankfully, she doesn't spend the climax tied to a chair like Anya did, so there's that. Plus, the name is one of the most memorable in the series. Chiles also seems to be capable of more acting range than Barbara Bach, but her line readings are almost as flat as Bach's was. Was there just something going around at this time, or did the ADR supervisor decide that emotionless readings from women were fine? It gets in the way of my enjoyment of their scenes. I also feel like it was a mistake to try to repeat the opposite agents warming up to each other thread. It worked fine in Spy because they were from opposing nations and Bond killed her lover. Here it seems to come out of nowhere. The most solid basis for Goodhead's frostiness is Bond's condescending remarks about her intelligence being uncommon for beautiful women, which I take issue with, but not for the reason that you might think. I don't buy that Bond has that attitude. I get that part of this is his game to seduce her, but it doesn't work for me. Besides, Moore's incarnation has already come across several fellow female intelligence operatives and a mystical witch, so I'm left confused as to why he goes this route. Maybe it's just me, but the charm doesn't play. Hugo Drax is another odd duck, but I lean much more positively with him. Script-wise, he's Stromberg again with a similar plan, but there are a number of small things that make him clearly the better of the two. First, Michael Lonsdale has a menacing monotone that really works. One minute he could be reading Shakespeare, and the next he could be barking orders at someone without changing much of his inflection, and they would both feel natural. Second, I think his plan is a little more thought out than Stromberg's, though there is one big question I have about it that I'll talk about later. Stromberg's new future after Armageddon never quite seemed thought out to me. Yes, he's obsessed with water and wants to lead the survivors beneath the sea, but how does he plan to get everyone else to go along with that? I always felt like I was missing something. Drax plans for a new perfect race of physical specimens that are loyal to him that he rules over, so his scheme feels a bit more fleshed out. Lastly, while I mentioned that the script was duller than some previous works, Drax gets some of the best and wittiest lines in the film. I don't know if it's Lonsdale's acting that sells them or something else, but I remember more of his individual lines and retorts than most of the other villains in the series. So kudos there. I missed my opportunity to talk about Chang in my henchman ranking video, but I don't know that I would have had that much to say about him there. Cast a blonde white guy in the role, and I don't think he would have stood out that much from people like Hans or Eric Kriegler. He's not awful at all, so he would go above them, but I don't feel much about him. He functions fine in the role, and that's about it. Jaws' return makes a much bigger splash, though not entirely for the right reasons. Richard Kiel is still fun in the role, but the increase towards slapstick with him I feel is a big blunder. It goes against what made him such a memorable presence in The Spy Who Loved Me. Jaws certainly had more comedic moments, but they were always balanced out with some more chilling material, and there are a couple of those here, but they are few and far between. Perhaps the most notable is in the alley with Manuela. His silent walk in the costume is so eerie. I kind of wish this was the first time we got to see Jaws in the film, as it would have been a powerful way to reintroduce him to the audience. But these kinds of moments are offset with him crashing into a circus tent from a free fall of several thousand feet, finding an instant girlfriend with Dolly at the cable car, and some really over-the-top expressions with him. It deflates much of the excitement I have for his reappearance. I'm not saying I want him to be completely serious and dark, but this feels like an overcorrection due to the number of fan letters received about the character. Turning him to the side of good in the finale feels motivated by the same thing, wanting to please those fans, though I'm more okay with that than the crescendo of silliness. It's a shame, really. I do like the two side Bond women here, though one is more effective than the other. Corinne Dufour is really memorable. Perhaps that's due to her seeming innocence and how she's subjected to quite a gruesome end by Drax's dogs, one of the most effective scenes in the film, by the way. She's also the final major part to be dubbed by longtime series veteran Nikki Vandersel, who had dubbed at least one female role in every official Bond film since Dr. No, with two exceptions. Manuela is just another stopgap Bond woman that serves as his contact in Brazil. She works well for the 5 minutes she's on screen, though I wish a way could have been found to expand her role, as she blips in and out of the picture without much fanfare. As far as production goes for this series, Moonraker is a mammoth one. Costing around $30 million, it was the most expensive of all the Roger Moore films, easily doubling Spy's budget. Yet you can't say that the money isn't apparent on the screen. Bond has had hit and miss special effects since the beginning, but Moonraker shows that the series has something to prove here. The shuttle launches are actually some of my favorites from any film in this era, with the flight into space sequence rightly being singled out for praise. I also love the way Drax's space station looks when it gets destroyed, as the filmmakers couldn't do with many explosions, hence the decision to use guns to shoot the model, and I applaud this choice. It gives it an almost otherworldly quality to its demise. Derek Meddings and crew already did a better job than usual with Spy, and here is one of their crowning achievements. This also ended up being the final Bond film for Ken Adam, making it his 7th. I get that he ruffled some feathers with how expensive his designs ended up being, but I feel like it was worth it. Moonraker boasts some stunning areas, like pretty much anything related to Drax, the centrifuge, the space station, the areas in the temple, and so on. John Barry comes back for his second attempt at a Roger Moore film, and I'm very split on this effort. It's an incredibly beautiful score overall, with Flight into Space being a standout. However, his music is what most stands in the way of my getting into Moonraker's action scenes. It's often too lethargic and legato-like, and it lulls me into a trance that doesn't vibe with the intensity of the action scenes. I do appreciate getting our 5th and final appearance of the 007 theme played during the boat chase. I've not talked much about this piece, as it's only really a staple of older films in the series and didn't survive the 70s. It's a great tune that has evolved and transposed into a different key from where it started in From Rush with Love. Moonraker is probably my least favorite version of it, but I hesitate to say it should be removed, as it was always a fun piece. I've talked before about Barry's tendency to hold back on the Bond theme, and I wondered if this was just the way he liked to work. Turns out, he seemed rather resentful of having to share some of the royalties of the scores with Monty Norman, the credited creator of the theme, and so it seemed like he pushed back where he could and tried to have his own material color the film. Thankfully, Barry is plenty talented that I find myself not missing the Bond theme as much as I do in some of the other films not scored by Barry, like GoldenEye or the Thomas Newman efforts. He was great at making the music sound appropriately Bondian without needing much of Norman's theme. I've also never been a huge fan of the title song, and I know I'm not alone in that, but it does score some points with me for having Shirley Bassey singing it. She can take the most mundane tune and make it sound like it's a number to bring the house down. I'm also quite partial to the major locations of the film. I've been to California plenty of times, though Drax's estate is the most French I've ever seen the place, though I have been to France as well. I fell in love with St. Mark's Square in Venice while I was touring there. And I lived for 2 years in Brazil, though that was in the Sao Paulo region. As much as I hate how flimsy the connecting tissue is between them in this plot, this is one of my favorite collections of locations. As far as space goes, I've never had a problem with the idea. Sure, it always seems to take a series into the realm of so-called science fact, according to Cubby, when it's introduced, but the Bond films were in a heightened reality anyway. Many of the gadgets and vehicles seem to be on this side of the extraordinary, so it would only take a nudge or two to make some of these films into bona fide science fiction. I just always accepted that space was someplace we might end up going to at some point, and besides, You Only Live Twice seemed comfortable with incorporating space into a Bond adventure, and the excellent video game Nightfire has Bond going into space with a climax, so I don't see why such a fuss should be made here. As I said, most of the action doesn't move the dial for me despite having some nice ideas, but there is one huge exception, and that is the pre-title sequence. The first in this series to feature the talents of B.J. Worth, Jake Lombard, and crew, I'm in awe that they even tried this. Special shoots had to be constructed. A support system was built for the cameraman so he wouldn't get killed shooting Panavision while skydiving with the stunt performance, and it took 88 jumps to complete the scene. Upon repeat viewing, some things really stand out, like how obvious it is that stuntmen have parachutes under their jackets, or that the shots are incredibly short, meaning that there are a lot more cuts than usual in editing. But I can easily forgive those things, as it's just an amazing looking sequence and wonderfully stimulating. It's my favorite part of the whole film. To close, I do have a few questions about this story. The first is with Holly Goodhead. She's revealed to be a deep cover operative of the CIA at Drax Industries. However, I'm surprised that throughout the course of the film, she's never told to work with Bond once he's revealed to her. I know this investigation is meant to be top secret, but I'm sure Holly would be sending regular reports to her superiors, and I don't think it would have taken too long for the CIA to figure out the new guy snooping around as 007. Considering that the Soviets in the last film considered the assignment to be important enough to open a diplomatic channel to the British and have Anya work with Bond, why wouldn't the CIA do the same here? Especially since Bond has worked with Felix Leiter several times by now on other top secret missions. My other question has to do with the space station. Drax has a radar jamming device, so no one is supposed to be able to pick it up from Earth. Okay, fine. However, I have a hard time buying that no one would figure out that Drax is up to no good in space. Maybe he would have been able to convince the world governments that the space station is for a legitimate purpose, but then how are they not alerted to its presence in orbit while it was being constructed? They have more than radar to monitor space even during the 1970s. And how come Holly doesn't know about the station, given that she was a lead scientist in Drax's organization? I know I'm thinking about this more than I probably should, and I don't apply this scrutiny to a lot of Bond films, but it was a question that grappled with my mind this last viewing, and I couldn't come up with an explanation, even if it was a flimsy one. Moonraker has a good film buried within it somewhere that can't seem to escape its more notorious aspects. It's not my least favorite Bond film, but it's one of the more frustrating ones because I can see the potential here, and these filmmakers just finished making a spectacular film just 2 years prior. It's a grand entry that largely feels like a true student of the previous films, but for every small step it takes forward, it takes a giant leap backward. A lot of reviewers have called it a cross between The Spy Who Loved Me and Star Wars, but I would hesitate to leave it at that. Most of the space material feels more influenced by 2001 than A New Hope, though saying Red Leader twice as background chatter and the final bit with the shuttle going after the probes feels very much taken from the latter. It's much slower and more opulent in its treatment of the material than A New Hope, which is probably for the best. But the original Star Wars succeeded because it was a great refreshment of rather standard storytelling devices and elements. It's not groundbreaking because it's the most forward-thinking film or the most advanced of its time. It's groundbreaking because it's a fantastic offering of the old-fashioned, made to remind us of why those elements have worked before and why they continue to be timeless. In that sense, The Spy Who Loved Me was a lot more like Star Wars. It's not terribly original for a Bond film, but it made those tropes feel fresh and new again. Moonraker weirdly feels tired, a regurgitation of what has been done before without much consideration before employing those same standards and fundamental pieces. It's just another Wednesday at the office, despite the luxurious stage upon which it performs its material. At the time, Moonraker benefited immensely from these same decisions. It was the highest grossing of the series until the Brosnan films, and it did stay with people. Most recall it as the one where Bond goes to space, but leaving it at that is condemning it to a cheap label. It is capable of soaring much higher than it does, but it's also content to be the same sandwich we got last time, just with snazzier new wrapping. The effects of this film did largely influence the direction of the series moving into the 1980s. Despite the success, the price tag was too much for United Artists, who in turn demanded that the budget be kept more in check for future films. The creators also felt that they had gone as far in scale as they should, and thus Bond should return to his roots. Instead of trying to top Moonraker in vision, the creators turned back to Ian Fleming and tried to do a more character-driven espionage entry. This was quite the gamble at the time, and it ushered in a new era for the series, one where the effects are still being felt over 40 years later.
My name is Bond. James Bond.
In filmmaking, re-evaluation is a healthy thing for a series to do. Just because something is working well doesn't mean it will continue to do so without some experimentation, and sometimes that means going back to the basics. The old adage of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is not always a great rule to live by, as the cultural landscape is on such a fast-tracked evolution that it only takes a few years for certain films to feel outdated within the market. The Bond franchise has certainly had this problem more than a few times, and I personally think coming up with a fresh angle for Bond in order to stay relevant in today's climate is precisely the reason why we've gone for years now without any solid movement from Eon about casting a Bond 7 or starting up a new film. Coming off the hugely financially successful back-to-back duo of The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, the producers probably could have continued on that track for a while and done fine. Yet they had their sights set on the big picture and sought to ensure that Bond was going to continue on long after their time. And it seemed that the way forward was for Bond to come home and to tackle a low-key adventure that was interlaced with Cold War influences and character development, similar to what some of the earlier films had done. This didn't necessarily sit well with everyone at the time, and it certainly doesn't now. For Your Eyes Only can be really offsetting if you watch the series in sequence and are enjoying the trajectory of the last few films. In fact, I would say that there are few Bond films that produce such wildly different reactions amongst audiences as Eyes. I find this film to be fascinating for a bunch of reasons, and perhaps that fascination is why I return to this one more often. After finally wrapping up his long-standing rivalry with Blofeld, James Bond is assigned to the investigation of the murder of the Havelocks. They are a deep-sea exploration couple who were secretly contracted by the British government to find the recently wrecked St. George's, a ship that was carrying the ATAC system. The ATAC system coordinates the Polaris submarines of the Royal Navy, and in the wrong hands, could give the Soviets a way to cause inexplicable damage. Bond tracks down the murderer of the Havelocks, Hector Gonzalez, to his Spanish villa, but he is unfortunately captured, and Gonzalez is killed shortly afterwards by Melina, the daughter of the Havelocks. With the investigation seeming to be at a standstill, Bond proposes to track down the man who paid Gonzalez for the murder, who was at the villa at the time. The man is called Locke, rumored to be an enforcer for the Dove, a smuggler based in the Mediterranean. Working with some local contacts and being hunted by Locke at every turn, Bond must uncover the deception at the heart of this plot and prevent a Cold War disaster. For the longtime fan, the influences of For Your Eyes Only are obvious, specifically the original Bond author Ian Fleming and the films From Russia with Love and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Everyone who has reviewed this film has talked about it bringing Bond back down to earth, and that was a conscious choice on the filmmakers' parts. Director John Glenn, who had been on past films as both an editor and second unit director, had strong ideas about what he wanted to do with the film, having been inspired by what had been done in the past, as well as leaving his own personal stamp on the film. For me, the return to the fundamentals of the series is welcome, but that's not entirely what the film is doing. Sure, it is in a large part, but there are also major characters and scenes that feel right at home in a traditional Roger Moore outing, and so this film is pulled in two directions. I imagine the filmmakers were nervous about reinventing the series while still having Roger in the lead, since he had already well established his take on the character and had been going on for almost a decade at this point. It's surprising then that Roger Moore doesn't feel out of place as Bond in this outing. Maybe that's because he's noticeably starting to look a little aged in the role, but for a more tempered and weathered Bond, Roger makes it work really well. He's given some harder moments to portray and asked to actually play a character this time out. Truth be told, I think the story works better for a returning 007 actor like him, rather than introduce someone new in the part, as very well could have happened. He still has the quips, but he's not doing something so tongue-in-cheek as he had been doing before, and this is the first time that Bond feels like a veteran who's been at this a long time. He comes off as more wise and calculated this time out, and while I understand if that's too jarring for some people, I adore getting to see Moore take a stab at it. His relationship with Melina feels very tender, which is befitting of someone who has experienced the loss of loved ones. The film intelligently begins with opening on Tracy's grave, reminding us of the most vulnerable time in the man's life, and Moore, thankfully, is adhering to what the story needs rather than what he felt comfortable playing, most of the time. There is an anecdote that Moore has shared about his pushing back against the writers during this film. In one of the scenes with Melina, she was going to describe her childhood and how lonely she felt, and Bond would have expressed some sympathy towards that. Moore felt as though his Bond wouldn't say that, and so it was excised from the finished film. I respectfully have to disagree. Bond grew up an orphan, losing his parents in a climbing accident, hence why the climbing scene has some extra subtle weight and tension for longtime fans. And so he would be somewhat sympathetic towards a young woman suddenly dealing with the loss of her parents and the complex emotions that come with that. I'm not saying that he would necessarily cry his eyes out with her, but I think he would internalize his thoughts and be gentle with her in that moment, and Moore does play things like that at several points throughout. I wish this exchange had been left in the film, as it only would have benefited it. Melina Havelock, played by Carol Bouquet, is a fine Bond woman. This is the first time in a while that the leading lady has had a more active role in the story and isn't exploited much for her sexual appeal, and Bouquet does a great job at playing a conflicted woman who has had much of the joy in her life suddenly sucked out. However, the end of her arc is fumbled. When Bond confronts her about killing Christados at the monastery, he seems prepared to step aside and allow her to make her choice after warning her about losing her soul to revenge. But then Columbo kills Christados very quickly and takes the choice away from her. I'm fine with Columbo ultimately being the one to kill Christados, but the way it plays out on film, it robs Melina of a more cathartic ending, and I think that's a shame. Her character still stands out as being one of the better ones in the series. I'm especially taken with Bouquet's striking eyes, but she's missing an ending, and thus she misses out on being one of the best women in the series. Topol as Columbo is an inspired choice. Because the actor has so much natural presence and charisma, he instantly endears himself to me and becomes one of my favorite allies in the series. With reduced on-screen time, you need an actor like Topol to convince the audience that the man not only runs a smuggling operation of considerable size and influence, but also has a lot of history with the villain, despite them getting so little screen time together. Based on the dialogue that both men offer towards that shared past, I would have loved to have seen these two share the screen in a quieter moment and watch them verbally face off against each other. But even as is, Columbo brings back fond memories of Pedro Armendáriz as Karen Bay and is similarly charming and likable. The same cannot be said for Luigi Ferrara. One of the many allies who ends up as sacrificial lambs in this series, he's one of the least memorable. I keep forgetting that Bond is supposed to have been affected by this man's death, and part of my dislike could be an interpretation problem. He seems really conspicuous to me in that scene at the resort at Tofana. It's cartoony, him wearing sunglasses, practically always looking over his shoulder, and thus I just want to yell at him, why don't you go read a magazine in the corner and always look over the top? Let's make it really obvious that you're not a spy. There are two major secondary Bond women in this film, and I bet you can't guess which one I like more. To be fair, Bibi Dahl is supposed to be a minor in this film, despite the actress only being a year younger than Carol Bouquet, and Bond's reactions to her are pretty funny. But she does start to get on my nerves. She's one of the elements I talked about earlier that feels like a hangover from one of the earlier Moore films. My only problem with Cassandra Harris's Countess Liesel is that she's killed off so quickly. I really liked her, enjoyed her chemistry with Roger, and thought she could have added more to the film had she stuck around for another few minutes. She also feels magnified because of the well-known fact that she was married to future Bond Pierce Brosnan at this time. I used to watch Remington Steele a lot, and in fact own all 5 seasons, and she played a wonderful recurring character named Felicia who had a past with Brosnan's character, and thus I know she's capable of giving so much more to this picture. One of my main problems with this film is the villains. I don't think anyone is particularly great here. Julian Glover is obviously a very gifted actor who can play wonderful villains, but the decision to make him a concealed villain prevents him from giving us something really juicy. Both Glover and Glenn worked hard to make sure he didn't do much that was obviously villainous before the turn, and I think that would have worked well if the character exuded the same sort of charm as Columbo or even General Koskov in The Living Daylights. Glover isn't doing anything particularly wrong with the role, but he's not allowed to make much of an impression, and so I can't imagine anyone being passionate one way or another about his part here. Eric Kriegler is our third muscular blonde henchman in the series, and unfortunately he falls flat, quite literally with that embarrassing death. He does get more to do than Hans from You Only Live Twice, thankfully, but he's nowhere near as interesting, presented, or well-written as Red Grant. He's a serviceable story point kind of character, but I doubt he's got a large fan circle championing him as one of the greats in the series. Locke does fare better, but not by much for me. Like Molina, he's got some striking eyes and is suitably creepy, and if you listen to his backstory as described by Bond during the Identigraph scene, that has the potential to produce one of the most unnerving and understated henchmen in the series. But after he's killed off, I quickly forget he was ever a thing. I really don't mind less colorful characters that go for genuine chills and thrills, but they need a moment to deliver on that menace. Locke is missing that, and so he feels like an empty threat to me. It also probably doesn't help that I keep thinking of Rainn Wilson from The Office whenever I see him. There are 2 bits that I like with him. The first is a tiny moment during the raid on the warehouse where he's holding 2 machine guns. I think I just like this image more than anything else. The other is, of course, his standout death. It's well known that Roger was uncomfortable playing this, but I can't thank him enough for that moment. It is so cold and so right in the moment that it instantly becomes one of my favorite Bond scenes in the series. There are a few more members of the cast that I wanted to call out. This is the best Moneypenny scene in the Moore era for me, and Lois Maxwell looks like she's finally genuinely flirting with Bond for the first time since, I'd say, Diamonds Are Forever. Plus, the hat toss is a great touch. Unfortunately, Bernard Lee passed away before he could complete his scenes as M for the film, and so we get James Villiers as Chief of Staff Bill Tanner. I've never been particularly impressed by this performance, partly because of his almost aggressively dismissive attitude towards Bond throughout. A young Charles Dance makes his first credited on-screen appearance as a young henchman named Klaus. If you know who Charles Dance is, I bet you get a kick out of this like I do. If you don't, remember what happens when the North marches on the South. John Glenn is a fine first-time director. He's definitely got room to grow, and I feel like he does as he moves through this series. The one place where I think he excels immediately is, unironically, the action scenes. Obviously, he worked closely with his second unit director to make sure that these sequences were memorable, and he succeeds. Some scenes, like the drive in the country and the ski chase, are absolute action highlights of the series for me, and bring a smile to my face every time. I also adore the way he stages the climbing scene with Bond and not Adam Driver. Rick Sylvester, who already cemented his legacy with James Bond with the excellent ski jump scene in The Spy Who Loved Me, returns to perform an equally jaw-dropping stunt by falling off the edge of a mountain, and it takes my breath away every time. My one note with the action is that while I like the sequence with Bond and Melina on the St. George's and the attacking gym diver, I do have to wonder if the submarine fight afterwards adds a beat too many to that section of the film. It makes sense story-wise that Christados would send several people down to steal the ATAC, but it does prolong the underwater action a bit too much for me. The biggest thing I have no negative notes on is the score by Bill Conti. If you've seen my soundtracks ranking video, you know I put this at number 2. I adore his varied use of synth and orchestra, his way of mixing both ear-grinning fun and thrills in his action sequences, and his intelligent use of tempo with rising tension during quieter scenes. The biggest compliment I have to offer is for his frequent incorporation of both the main title theme and the James Bond theme. He masterfully uses both of them to enhance his score. Every time I listen to the soundtrack, I can't help but both dance and be emotionally moved during the 60-minute presentation. I'm tempted just to let the rest of this video play out in silence so that you can listen to it with me. As many of you are also probably aware, For Your Eyes Only is one of my favorite songs in the series. Something about Sheena Easton's performance moves me nearly to tears every time. It's so heartbreakingly beautiful and melodic. It was rightly nominated for a Best Song Oscar that year. The writing is generally a step up from what we had been experiencing for the last few films, and that's thanks to the service of both longtime Bond veteran Richard Maybaum here and newcomer to the writer's room Michael G. Wilson, who of course had been with the series for a while in different capacities, was Cubby's son-in-law, and would go on with Barbara Broccoli to produce all of the Bond films starting from GoldenEye through to now. This is one of the more verbose scripts in the series, and there are quite a few things that fly under the radar that really shouldn't, but this film represents the beginning of a maturity to the series that it sorely needed. That's not to say that there won't be fun, rather superfluous adventure films to come, but in many ways, I feel like Eyes was a predecessor for the more serious and character-driven films of both Timothy Dalton and Daniel Craig. But even Brosnan's films took a cue from this one by having Bond personally tied into the mission in some way, or be more affected than he had in the past. I'm pretty sure this is Wilson's influence, given his stated preference in Bond films, and the direction he and Barbara have taken the series. I also want to talk about that pre-title scene. It gets the film off to a roaring start and works as a great tonal thesis for the film, saying, we're not leaving the comedy behind entirely, but we're going to ground the character a bit. And I love that Cubby and crew took the opportunity to prove they don't need Blofeld and Spectre for the series to succeed. However, given the weight the scene would have for fans of the series, it feels wrong to wrap up that dangling plot thread in just 5 minutes. Most of us wish that Diamonds Are Forever would have followed on from Majesties as a revenge thriller, and this scene doesn't do much to abate that desire. Given the real time that has passed between the productions of Majesties and Eyes, I think I'm ultimately fine with this Bond not getting revenge on Blofeld in such a passionate way, given that this is an older and wiser Bond. And doing so the other way for this film would especially jar with the later story with Melina. But it does add salt to the wound that is the botched continuity this series has given us concerning Blofeld. And plus, I don't buy that the younger version of Bond wouldn't have gone after Blofeld immediately after Tracy's death. A 50-year-old Bond tempered by loss getting this kind of revenge? Okay. A 30-year-old Bond? No way. This is the third Bond film in a row that goes to Italy for part of its action, and fair enough. Italy is such a diverse country with many great locations left to be used for Bond, and Cortina d'Ampezzo is a great choice. Most movie fans probably recognize this town from the original Pink Panther with David Niven and Peter Sellers. It's a gorgeous location that feels a little less glamorous than someplace like Venice. It's an almost sleepy place stuck within the mountains. But given that Eyes is a more subdued kind of Bond film, it feels perfect. On a side note, I visited Cortina years ago and I have fond memories of this place, particularly the local ice rink. I'm also a big fan of finally getting to go to Greece. While it doesn't go to the obvious places like Athens, it takes the opportunity to show the beautiful small towns and coastline, which are wonderfully dreamlike and picturesque, perfect for a Bond film. I do have a big question regarding this plot, which is with the choice to bomb the St. George's at the beginning. Upon realizing that they're sinking, the crew are instructed to destroy the ATAC, which unfortunately they don't get to do. Why does Christados, or Locke, whoever did the bombing, choose this way to try to get the ATAC if there was a good chance it would have been destroyed in the process? If it's so important to their scheme, you think they would have been a bit more careful with their methodology. And I don't think this is something they overlooked, as Melina even asks Bond about it later before they get out of the submarine to go looking for it. For Your Eyes Only is a film that asks quite a bit from its audience. If you were enjoying the previous films and their high-flying fun, this can feel like a dose of cold water. But if you're like me and felt like the series needed a shot of reality, then that dose of cold water will have its intended effect. It's not as exciting and fast nor thrill a minute as some of the previous films. It takes a risk in slowing down the action in order to have a more complicated story filled with characters who actually feel like real people. The action is still spectacular, Moore is ever reliable as Bond, and there is some good fun to be had throughout, but much like the best Bond films of old, this movie is content to trust its audience to be engaged enough with the material to endure a less rapid pace, and our trust in it is well worth the reward. I personally would cite the films as one of the more problematic entries on paper, as its story doesn't quite come together, it has some rather weak antagonists, and there's a feeling of reluctance to ditch the campier Moore gags. But I always come away pleased with the experience and pondering what I've just seen. While I'd cite The Spy Who Loved Me as the quintessential Roger Moore film in that it showcases all the actor does well, Eyes gives me an adventure that ticks off a lot of my own personal boxes from what I want to see in a Bond film, and thus it's the clear winner for my favorite Roger Moore Bond film, and one of my personal favorites in the entire series. Eyes did well enough at the box office, but there was some stiff competition that year. One of the rivals being the heavily Bond-inspired Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of the greatest films ever made. And so the filmmakers had to be careful moving forward. With Roger seeming to want to leave the series after a solid run of 5 films, it seemed like it was time to move on and establish someone new in the part. But the reappearance of an old adversary made Eon reconsider its stance, making 1983 a year that very well could have spelled doom for Bond if not handled well.
Bond. James Bond.
Competition is a necessary headache that we have to deal with, and it's not always a bad thing because growth and change can come from conflict, but in the cinema, that can sometimes backfire. For example, in 1997, 2 films about volcanoes were released as part of the CGI-enhanced disaster craze, and while both had their merits, one ended up more critically liked while the other had the bigger box office, and yet both have faded into relative obscurity. In the crowded world of today's cinema, where we often see gargantuan franchises turn out various entries in quick succession, this can lead to oversaturation in the marketplace that will ultimately hurt all involved. But even with today's climate, very rarely will we see multiple films featuring the same lead character released in the same year as competitors from different companies. I've heard many people claim that 1983 was the first time that we saw 2 James Bond pictures at the box office. Not only is that not true, as 1967 saw both Charlie Feldman's Casino Royale and the Eon-produced You Only Live Twice, but depending on where you live, 1964 had 2 Bond pictures have their theatrical releases. But 1983 was unique in that the 2 pictures were from rivaling companies, and were attempts at being straight Bond pictures. I'd hesitate to call Octopussy a serious film without some sort of qualifier. The legendary Sean Connery was back as 007, a role that he famously had mixed feelings about, and the film, Never Say Never Again, was being produced by Kevin McClory, who also produced Thunderball, and directed by Irvin Kershner, who had just wrapped up his work on The Empire Strikes Back, the smash hit sequel to the original Star Wars. During this time of turmoil, Roger Moore was seriously thinking about departing from the role after being lured back in For Your Eyes Only. So Eon was on the prowl for a new James Bond, and the man who was closest to getting the part was James Brolin, who actually shot some screen tests, had a wardrobe fitting, and moved to England for filming. But at the 11th hour, they managed to sign Roger for his 6th film, thinking that an established Bond was the only way they might compete with Connery's film. And it's hard to argue that this idea doesn't make some kind of sense. The marketing strategies for both are also really interesting. Never Say Never Again leaned into the return of its star like it was on the same level as a Beatles reunion, while Octopussy made its series heritage the selling point. Yeah, the other film has Connery, but ours is from the people who made all of the other official ones you love, and it has every element you'd want from a Bond film. In the end, both did very well at the box office. Never Say Never Again made the bigger splash on its opening weekend, while Octopussy had the bigger revenue overall by the end of its run. But money isn't everything, and so the question is posed. How could Roger Moore possibly fare against the legendary Connery at playing the same game? Two knife-wielding killers chase down a man dressed as a clown late at night in Germany. The clown is 009, and he is in possession of a Fabergé egg. He is killed by the duo, but not before delivering the egg to the English ambassador. The egg is discovered to be a fake, and the real one is set to be auctioned off. James Bond heads to the auction and decides to follow the buyer, Kamal Khan, back to his home in India. Once there, he discovers that Kamal is in league with both the Russian General Orlov and a mysterious smuggler and cult leader named Octopussy. Bond must dodge a legion of killers while also uncovering what Kamal has planned with the egg that involves a general bent on Russian dominance and a smuggling ring that uses various legitimate businesses like a circus for cover. Octopussy is a rather curious entry for me. After For Your Eyes Only made a statement about grounding Bond, this one turns back to The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker territory. Based on box office numbers, Eyes did well, so I have to wonder if this shift was either because audience reception to that film was mixed, or because Connery was known for doing the more grounded, serious type of films, and so they felt as though they should lean into what Moore excels at. In any event, Octopussy is a clear attempt at bombastic fun with lots of comedy thrown in. This is a very tricky thing to get right, because you can either end up with the most fantastic, escapist entertainment, or an inane drag. The film lands closer to the former for me, but it swan dives into the latter occasionally as well. Yet among the more notorious things like the Tarzan yell, British agents dressing up as clowns, and the fun with the animals, at the core of this film is an espionage thriller akin to Eyes. It's steeped in the politics at the time, though it continues to follow Cubby's mantra of not villainizing the Russians as a whole. And there's a lot of dangerous scenarios and shifty characters throughout. Thus, you might be caught off guard with how one minute you have Bond zooming in on some cleavage with a camera, and then the next you have a guy with a yo-yo buzzsaw. John Glenn repeatedly stated that he wanted to make his Bond films a reflection of the older Connery films, where gadgets were less prevalent and Bond's ingenuity was emphasized. Yet this determination to have that groundedness is often at odds with the comedic bits which signal that the film is going for something more flamboyant. Those earlier films certainly had comedy, sure, but they were never so outlandish so as to call attention to themselves and often just felt like in-character moments. A lot of the lighter material here feels artificially inserted in order to appease certain mandates, and thus the jarring tone shifts that many have criticized in a lot of Glenn's Bond films. If you are willing to accept this as part of the piece, then these films will provide massive amounts of entertainment. If you are striving for a certain verisimilitude with Bond, then I imagine Moore's last films are amongst your least favorites. It all comes down to a simple question. How much brainpower and logical story progression are you willing to give up so that you can be entertained for a few hours? Bond films, along with most action films, have always required this as part of the admission price, and some just take it further than others. I don't bring up this point to condemn spectacle films. There are plenty that provide cranium-stimulating depth with fantastic action, but instead to suggest that they often play by different rules. Much as I should not go into a Godzilla film trying to view it as I would an Ingmar Bergman film, I should not go into classic Bond expecting it to be 3 Days of the Condor or The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. If it seems like I'm being all over the place with how I land on this film, that is accurate. Octopussy commits some of the incriminating mistakes that drag down films like A View to a Kill for me, and so I should disregard the film just on principle. Yet a lot of it entertains me in the same way that The Spy Who Loved Me does. It's a clownish charlatan, much like Bond at the circus, pretending to be a more grounded Cold War thriller when it's really more like a dime novel, going for superficial thrills rather than long-lasting depth. Despite my preferences in Bond films, I'd be lying if I said that the movie doesn't mostly win me over to its side. There are two big influences on the story. The first is Ian Fleming, and the other is Goldfinger. The first may seem like a silly thing to claim, but hear me out. There's a lot more here than you might think. Obviously, the auction scene is taken right out of the short story Property of a Lady, including that line, actually, and Octopussy's father and his background are taken from the titular tale, but there's a few more that I noticed. The backgammon scene is very similar to a scene in the Moonraker novel where Sir Hugo Drax cheats at cards and Bond figures out his trick rather quickly. Khan's final line of "spend the money quickly, Mr. Bond," is almost verbatim what Drax says. The scene with 009 and the twins shares elements of both The Living Daylights and From A View to a Kill. And the scene in which Bond is disguised as a clown and the audience thinks that's who he is and that he's part of the act is remarkably similar to an unused Fleming scenario where the Russian killer is disguised as a clown and the audience think that the fight is part of the act. As for Goldfinger, the comparisons often speak for themselves. Both plots deal with smuggling valuable materials and exploding a nuclear bomb at a military installation. Both feature a leading lady who runs a group of talented young women that Bond wins over to his side. Both feature a pre-credit scene in a Latin American country. Both feature a villain cheating at a game and Bond distracts him by pulling out something valuable that he clearly wants. Both have henchmen with unique headwear demonstrating their physical strength by crushing some item that was key to said game, and both have their climax in a personal plane with someone falling to their death. Yet, despite these similarities, I wouldn't label Octopussy a remake of Goldfinger, but instead as a student learning from its more accomplished mentor. And weirdly, this makes symmetrical sense, as For Your Eyes Only was patterned a lot after From Russia with Love. Roger Moore certainly feels more in his element with this one than Eyes, and while that film churned out a more understated and somber performance, this one is far more familiar. He never takes himself too seriously, and so he avoids the pitfalls that we might have seen with a newcomer. He's a safe bet when it comes to Bond, but you do get a feeling after watching Eyes that perhaps he should veer out of his comfort territory more often because he really delivered there. Yet I can't blame him for knowing his own boundaries, and it rarely interferes with my enjoyment of his films, and there's usually a fantastic moment with his acting in just about every film. Here, it's the scene with Bond and Orlov on the train car. His realization at the horrific aftermath of the scheme, while the general is practically grinning with prideful delight, is so sick and awesome to watch. There's something that feels authentic about that scene, making it my acting highlight of the whole film. However, Moore has great bits throughout, most notably in the love scene with Octopussy where he refuses her offer to go into business with her. Moore keeps in mind that Bond's purpose is always to the mission and duty first, and that's one of the character traits I love about 007. It's inspiring to watch a man so principled like that he can refuse the temptations that I might succumb to. To summarize, Moore's take is starting to feel a little long in the tooth, but I can't deny that it's a fun take to watch from time to time. Maud Adams knocks it out of the park with Octopussy for me. Whereas I felt like Andrea Anders was a little out of place in Golden Gun, Octopussy makes for one of the most mysterious and intriguing Bond women. It's the first time in a while that the age difference doesn't feel so obvious, and I'm convinced that a large reason for that is because Adams is selling us on this woman being as skilled and intelligent as Bond, but not in the same areas. She's an accomplished smuggler and businesswoman, devoting herself to helping her cult of women in a misguided but noble-sounding way, and she has a lot of respect for Bond. The personal connection with her father was a great move, and thus it makes it easy to see her as the one woman during Moore's run that I could actually see a future with and that has a deeper connection with Bond. I'm not suggesting they settle down or anything, but that I could see them keeping in touch and trying a relationship of some kind after the film is over. They really are two of a kind, and thus Octopussy ranks as my favorite leading lady of Moore's 7 films. This is the first film in a while that successfully uses two main villains for its story. Louis Jourdan's Kamal Khan is a mix of slyness and charm. Much like Hugo Drax, he has some great lines, and he doesn't seem to underestimate the threat that Bond could pose to his plans. He also has a duplicitous streak that's a lot of fun. He's willing to double-cross anyone if it serves him personally. He might not be at the top of the pack for villains in this series, but he's a worthy addition. Steven Berkoff's General Orlov is ridiculously campy and overacted. But I've seen Berkoff in a few things, and knowing his theater chops, this is the kind of thing that he brings to his performances, and it's entertaining if you're willing to just go with it. He still manages to be a credible threat, and I know there will be at least one acting choice or delivery in every one of his scenes that I'll adore. I understand if he breaks the reality of the film for you, but everyone has their guilty pleasures, and Berkoff's performance is one of mine. I always found Gubinda to be one of the best henchmen in the series. Sure, he's very much a template henchman that you might expect, but maybe it's because he doesn't indulge in the broader comedy, and he's so physical and gets down and dirty that my eyes are drawn to him. There's something that's genuinely scary about this guy, and thus he's a real menace. On a side note, I do love the moment when he hesitates before going out of the plane to fight Bond. It gets a chuckle from me every time. Magda seems to be an attempt at a femme fatale. I like her when she's around. I especially love the moment when she exits the hotel room, but I can't say that she's a favorite of mine, as once Octopussy is introduced, Magda fades into the background. She's a character that worked well enough, and ultimately that might be the point, but I'm hard-pressed to say that she's a standout in her field. VJ is one of the more likable Bond allies, and I wish the union dispute behind the scenes didn't force the filmmakers to split his role with Sadruddin, played by returning Albert Moses, and who I have really nothing to say about. Every time I watch this film, I keep thinking he's in more of it, but he's actually only in a few scenes. Armitage makes the most of his time, and his presence is missed when he exits the film. Robert Brown makes for a fairly standard M in his debut as the character, but to be fair, it's clear they wanted another Bernard Lee type for the role, as there was nothing wrong with that. And Brown does a fine job, and I enjoy having a proper M back in the films after the unimpressive James Villiers Tanner performance from the last film. By the way, I like to think that Admiral Hargreaves and Brown's M are the same man, as it's a harmless fan theory that the films never offer much opposition to. This is also the best use of Q so far in the series, and Desmond Llewellyn looks to be having a great time here. Lastly, I wanted to give a shout out to the knife-throwing twins, Mishka and Grishka. Ever since doing the henchman ranking video, I keep running across people that I left off of that list, and while I'll stand by most of the omissions, I'm kicking myself a little for not putting these two on there. They wouldn't have been too high, but I feel like they're pretty efficient killers, and much like Gubinda, I'm not laughing at them at any point when they bring out their knives. I think in another film, the idea of killer twins could have been expanded on more, and under the right circumstances, we might have had another Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd situation on our hands. John Glenn once again proves himself as a fine director, excelling in his action scenes for the most part, while developing his craft on doing the dialogue-heavy scenes. For these lower-budget adventures where Bond eschews using gadgets as get-out-of-jail-free cards, Glenn is pretty adept at what makes them work. However, I'm really not a fan of the safari scene. It's a neat idea, but I think the execution is pretty bad. Beyond the jokes, I feel little tension here, and it's not because I know Bond will be fine. It's because of the animals. Each of these bits have no real payoff once they are introduced for Bond to deal with. For example, a crocodile is seen coming after Bond in one moment, but there's no follow through with that. Bond doesn't seem to have to deal with the croc, and it doesn't slow him down. Same idea for the snake going across his legs. Also, it feels pretty strange to have so many dangerous animals for Bond to come across, and we never see the pursuing party come across them as well. So they feel artificially inserted just for Bond to have obstacles, and thus the seams are starting to come apart, and I feel like there's writer manipulation of the action rather than the animals being natural hurdles to come across during the scene. It's easily my least favorite section of the film. But I don't want to dog on the film too much for its action, as we have some really great set pieces here. The Acrostar microjet in the beginning is a fantastic way for the film to open. There's a solid fight in Octopussy's quarters, and I'm especially fond of some of the choreography here. And there's a noteworthy moment before the fight begins where Bond is looking out a window and one of the henchmen is on the balcony behind him in the background. There's a glorious train fight that feels inspired by the truck chase in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and while it's not quite on that level, it's one of my favorite Bond action scenes. The finale on the top of the plane features some great work from the aerial stunt crew. Seriously, can we get BJ Worth and his men an honorary Oscar for all their work on this series? I even like the taxicab sequence in the middle where Bond has to leave for a bit in order to have some fun with the street performers. It is pretty silly, but I like that the scene continues Glenn's mantra of Bond not relying on gadgets to solve all of his problems, and thus he has to use his environment to get out of the situation. But above all, I commend the filmmakers for their handling of Bond dressing up as a clown to find the bomb. I know this is a bridge too far for some. Circuses and Bond don't seem to mix too well, despite their cropping up in several entries. But I think the scenario works beautifully, and I feel the rising tension throughout. It's actually one of my favorite suspense moments in all of Bond. Peter Lamont's sets are hit and miss for me. I love the way the Russian briefing scene looks at the beginning. It has a real Ken Adam feel to it, and I love the interior of both palaces. However, is it as obvious to anyone else that the exterior final fight outside the Monsoon Palace is shot on a set? John Barry comes back for his 9th Bond score, and I feel like he finally addresses some of the criticisms I had with his scores since Diamonds. He both crafts a soundtrack that works well within the film, which is a problem I expressed with Moonraker, and he integrates more interesting original material than usual. It's speculated that the reason that there is so much Bond theme in this one is that it was a deliberate choice by the filmmakers to compete with the Bond themeless Never Say Never Again. But whatever the reason, I love that Barry went with it. It's a favorite of mine. I'm not as big of a fan on the title song, though. I love its instrumental versions throughout, and Tim Rice gives us some great lyrics, but something about Rita Coolidge's vocal version feels mundane and meh to me. I also love a lot of the costume work for this one. Each character feels distinct, and the clothes look great. I already mentioned Magda's dress and how it's used for one scene. Octopussy has a really great dress for the finale, but I also love some of Roger Moore's outfits here. Having both his black and his white suits in the same film is a great idea, and I love the safari outfit he has. Gubinda has a collection of turbans here, and they're beautifully woven and tied together. I usually make a running game throughout involving the turbans he wears. Some of the finer points of the story are quite sloppy, particularly the handling of the Fabergé egg. I share Calvin Dyson's confusion on where the second egg goes once the real thing is discovered, and I can't believe Orloff just smashes the real one. But I also have to wonder, how did the real egg get out in the open in order to be auctioned off? We know that 009 is responsible for the fake one getting out, but I would assume that Khan and Orloff would have kept close tabs on the real egg, if not outright kept them themselves as a contingency plan, much like they do with the Romanov star. I also feel like that certain moments of Bond getting out of danger are pretty flimsy. I don't know about you, but I feel like this knife goes in farther than it should. How does Bond get out of this gorilla suit without Gubinda seeing him? Did the fake crocodile gadget that Bond drives kill the henchman in the water? Or was that a real crocodile that just happened to come along and kill the guy and Bond fakes his death and escapes? For many, Octopussy is the beginning of the end for Roger Moore as Bond. It tries to half and half it between Moonraker and Eyes, and that results in a mixed bag. The shifting tone is not always natural, and there's a lot of overfamiliarity to the piece during much of the runtime. The best way I can describe this film is trying to make a magnificent dinner out of leftovers. It's fairly obvious what pieces the film is using from the past, and there's a fair amount of fancy presentation to it. Yet, like Leftovers, a lot of those pieces are from things I loved before, and I have no qualms about eating them again. Sometimes the combination can leave a bad taste, but at other times, I'm really enjoying this time I spend with it, and there's more than a fair few things to really admire. I miss some of the improvements that I felt Eyes was striving to incorporate, and when I put on my analytical hat, Octopussy is one of the more run-of-the-mill and disappointing Bond films. But if I'm just looking for Roger charming women, doing covert spy work, high-flying action scenes, and villains with great lines, Octopussy hits all of those marks really well, and thus it delivers what it promises. So obviously 1983 didn't spell doom for the franchise, but despite my more favorable impressions of the film, it has grown to have more of a negative reputation and be a bit of a punchline for people. If you compare this to some of the earlier films like Russia and Goldfinger, it's strange to think that they're part of the same franchise. Despite the mixed reactions to the film, this style mostly continued on into the next official entry, which would be Roger Moore's final curtain call. But before we move on to A View to a Kill, we should first examine the rival Bond of 1983 and see if time has been kind to this outlying anomaly.
The name is Bond. James Bond.
When a film becomes infamous for its poor quality, people are just expected to dislike it on principle. Thus, taking a more positive outlook to the film can lead to a depressing situation, where you might be waving the flag of noteworthy awesomeness for something and few give you heed. One of the most derided James Bond films is A View to a Kill. The last of Roger Moore's run, it weirdly serves as an appropriate coda for the man. Keeping the comedy high while injecting more contemporary elements seems to have been the key theme of the Moore era. Sometimes that worked wonderfully, but it can also incredibly date the project. I unfortunately have never been a fan of this one myself. It was always the Moore film I was least likely to want to watch, and I've often pegged it as my least favorite official Bond film. That sentence doesn't mean it doesn't have its features, and I can't understand people's admiration for it, but the math just doesn't equate to a positive sum for me here. I consider the film something of a transitional piece, putting forth a classic 007 yarn rooted in the formula of the past, while also making a case for why Bond is still ahead of the curve and at the forefront of contemporary action cinema. This arguably has been the goal for all of the Bond films, but it's a risky balancing act that requires some careful consideration before embarking on that road. A View to a Kill tries to walk this tightrope, but whenever the producers start to become complacent of their success, the succeeding films become half-hearted, and View is definitely a victim of this cycle. James Bond brings back a microchip from the body of 003 in Siberia to England. Q analyzes it and points out that it is exactly the same as a brand of microchips from Zorin Industries, suggesting that the Russians have a pipeline into a Western corporation and are capable of making chips that can withstand nuclear blasts. Bond suggests looking into Max Zorin himself, given that the leak occurred after Zorin purchased the company who manufactured the chips. Upon an initial investigation, Bond finds that Zorin is involved in many suspicious ventures, but none more so than the oil industry in the San Francisco Bay Area. Traveling to California, Bond meets up with Stacy Sutton, an oil heiress and geologist who is putting Zorin through a long legal battle. The two began to investigate further into Zorn's activities, uncovering a horrifying plan meant to secure a monopoly on the microchip industry at the expense of the devastating destruction of Silicon Valley, the heartland of electronic production in the United States. In 1985, Cubby Broccoli was quoted as saying, "Let's face it, there's a sameness about James Bond that you can't escape." Roger Moore expressed a similar sentiment that year in an interview. "It's exactly the same as a child wanting to hear a bedtime story, and if you change a word or leave out a few lines because you think he's fallen asleep, or you're bored and you want to get off to bed yourself, look out. We want the comfort of sameness." I think no Bond film better encapsulates the arguments for and against sameness than A View to a Kill. The movie overall isn't doing much unique, much like I commented on with Octopussy. But unlike that film, there's a lethargic and passive sense to the execution a lot of the time. View makes me the most aware of the formula while I'm watching it, which is honestly fine. Not that I don't appreciate variety, but I'm the guy who usually orders the same meal I got last time at a Thai place. I like what I like, and as long as you're making the meal well, I have little qualms about it. But other than a few elements, there's little that gets me excited about the majority of this one. Its story does come together, but it seems so divergent in its bridges between the subplots that I often scratch my head trying to connect the dots. Roger's performance is still consistently fine, but the shtick is getting old, and however you rationalize the man's age away, it becomes a problem here in ways that it wasn't in earlier installments. The main woman is notorious amongst fans, and I've never had a single viewing where she hasn't been a primary issue. Most of the action scenes do nothing for me, and a lot of the individual connecting scenes feel unenthusiastic or uninteresting. The result is a film that fails in trying to make a case for why the old ways work best, and instead becomes a resounding pronouncement on the need to introduce new blood to the series. Roger Moore has done so much to keep Bond alive in the minds and hearts of fans, but even he can't escape the rising tide of time, and he was often the first one to point that out. Ever since the release of Moonraker, Moore had been toying with the idea of leaving the series. Yet I'm surprised how easy it was to get him to come back for a seventh film when he chose to accept the Octopussy assignment at the 11th hour. If he was so uncertain in 1982, I'm not sure why he didn't have similar feelings with this one. It doesn't help much that the production seems to be highlighting his age in a way that they haven't before. The goons are noticeably older, the wardrobe isn't quite as fitting, almost all the women remain in the perpetual state of peak physical beauty while the men noticeably age. There's a heavier emphasis on action scenes that downplay Bond's physicality, the poor hiding of the stunt doubles, and so on. By putting a spotlight on him like that, it jolts me out of the experience because I'm not allowed to get lost in the fantasy of the film. Roger isn't doing a lot wrong with the part, and he's still fun as long as you were already on board with him for previous films. That said, it does feel like it's time to move on, and I'm in the camp that feels Roger should have left after Octopussy. At this point, saying Tanya Roberts' Stacey Sutton is one of the least of the Bond women feels like saying Desmond Llewellyn is the best Q. You might have a different opinion, but the sentiment is expressed so often within the community that it can feel like wasted breath. The constant screams, the obliviousness she displays towards her situation at times, the fact that she rarely shows a moment of strength and determination on her own except in the finale, it's exhausting. I've never cared for this character, despite some nice groundwork laid for the part. I like that she could have just been left an oil heiress, but she decided to become a geologist and give Zorn a hard time legally. But that's about it with my positives. Even the other weaker Bond women don't actively drag down a film for me, and thus Stacey is an easy pick for my least favorite of that category. I spend a lot of my time with her just wishing she would leave the film and just let Bond go solo for this one. Thankfully, we have a couple of great villains here. Christopher Walken is one of those actors with a large cult following, much like Nicolas Cage or Jeff Goldblum, and so his casting initially seems like an odd choice given that he's following on from people like Louis Jourdan or Michael Lonsdale. However, this oddness is quickly forgotten about when you see how much fun Walken is having with Max Zorin. He has a presence about him and a mastery of delivering barbed wire dialogue. You can tell there's a darkness behind his delivery of the lines, but physically he betrays nothing about his villainy. Plus, he really does embody the craziness his backstory lays out. The odd laughs, the maniacal stares, his willingness to bump off people on a whim, it adds up to the best villain we've seen since Scaramanga, and arguably is even better. The choice to have him execute almost everyone in the mine may seem excessive in its violence. Even Moore and Walken were uncomfortable with it, but I adore that we have a moment like this. I complained with Never Say Never Again that Largo never had a moment to show off his brand of craziness, and I'm glad to be covering a film immediately afterwards that is a great example of what I was talking about. Plus, as long as the authorities don't look too closely at some of the bodies with bullet holes in them, having everyone perish in the flooding helps to sell the idea that the destruction of Silicon Valley was an accident resulting from natural causes. It's amusing to me that the weaker two Moore films happen to have some of the best villains, and it further fuels my point that no Bond film is without merit. Grace Jones' Mayday is also iconic. She's got such a striking profile, is often the first to jump into the action, and is a woman of few words. Yet she has an independence about herself that helps to sell her turn at the end. By the way, I feel like Mayday's betrayal works so much better than Jaws' at the end of Moonraker. She's got hard evidence that Zorn never cared about her, and as a scorned lover, she knows the biggest FU she can pull off is to ruin his grand scheme. Almost gleeful about the irony of the situation, she then immediately shows a stone-cold face when she sees Zorn's blimp just before her death. I love everything about this. It's an excellent character beat. I'm not too crazy about the other villains, though, and that's okay given the shining beacons of light we just covered. Scarpine is fine, I guess, but he just seems secondary to Mayday, and given how effective she is at her job, I'm not sure that he's really that necessary to have around, though I'm glad Zorn has more than one loyal henchman. Carl Mortner is a fun idea, helping to add legitimacy to Zorn's madness, though I wish he wasn't quite as stereotypical a mad scientist in his profile. Alison Doody, best known for her turn as Elsa Schneider in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, has an early part as Jenny Flex. But while she and Papillon Soso's Pan Ho are often in the background of various scenes, they're just heavies, and so there's nothing to get excited or disappointed about them. The rest of the supporting cast is fine. Patrick Macnee is a delight as Sir Godfrey Tibbett. Highlights include his great chemistry with Roger throughout, and the fact that he's an active part of the investigation, often going off on his own accord to help out. Macnee is a great character actor who I've seen in a number of things, most notably the Avengers TV show from the 1960s, a show that is responsible for giving us quite a few great people to the Bond series, by the way, and he is sorely missed when he's killed off. When Bond discovers his body, Moore gets to express one of my favorite minor character traits of Bond. He is respectful to those that have just passed on and takes a moment to acknowledge that. David Hipp, yet another Indiana Jones veteran, plays Felix Leiter substitute Chuck Lee. He's fine in the part, but his death is pretty unceremonious and he doesn't get that much to do. As a side note, I don't just call him a Leiter substitute just because he comes from the CIA. That is who initially was supposed to be here, but in order to capitalize on the Asian community within San Francisco, and I suspect partly because the character dies later on, the part was changed. The MI6 regulars are pretty much what you'd expect, though along with Moore, I feel Lois Maxwell's age here more than in any other installment. I do love that she gets to get out of the office for a bit, though I must admit, the My Fair Lady reference is pretty unfunny. Gogol's presence is a bit wasted in the film, though I like the idea of the main villain being a renegade KGB agent. Pola Ivanova is an okay part of the film, though given her groan-worthy Tchaikovsky line and how she blips in and out of the story, I'm actually glad that this was a new character rather than a returning Anya Amasova as was originally planned. By the way, why do the Bond films seem to have such horrible luck with getting returning cast members? This has happened several times where they hope to get someone back, the person will end up declining or is unavailable, and they basically cross out the name of the character and change it to someone else without drastically making it a different person, thus making the obvious substitution even more obvious. Finally, it's fun to see future action star Dolph Lundgren, then boyfriend of Grace Jones, get a small cameo. This is the same year the man got his breakout role of Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, and it's an instant reminder of the time period in which this film was made. This is easily my least favorite of John Glenn's 5 Bond films. It just doesn't have the sense of groundedness that his best efforts have, and it's not as fun as Octopussy. Bond still relies less on gadgets here, but that direction isn't accompanied with the stronger focus on character that his other films have. Plus, there's no pigeon jump scare. The outright comedic bits of the film constantly leave me bewildered like I'm being hit with a brick. Seriously, I'm not sure I can quite articulate why the Union Jack being on Bond's parachute in The Spy Who Loved Me works, but that same symbol on Bond's ice submarine feels like it's from Austin Powers. So much of the film feels stretched out without some strong connecting through lines. Bond initially starts with trying to investigate the company because of a microchip leak, though that is immediately put into the background so that we can deal with horse steroids, which really has nothing to do with the story other than to demonstrate that every aspect of Zoran's operations are shady. We then leave that behind entirely to deal with the oil wells being replaced with seawater, which eventually leads to flooding Silicon Valley along with enacting an earthquake that is destroying part of the San Andreas Fault. It's quite a stretch throughout, and while I'm glad they eventually worked the well activity back into the main plot, it does seem wholly unrelated to the scheme until Sutton fills in the blanks later, so I'm not sure why Bond in the moment thinks this is worthy of investigation. Though I suppose he's following the only leads he has, N.S. Sutton in America and Bob Connolly's reference to the oil interests in California. The film does fill in the blanks eventually, but it feels like Bond has read the script and is one step ahead of us. He knows where he has to be in order to propel the story forward, rather than the story feeling a bit more natural in its investigation. As much as I threw shade at Golden Gun for shifting back and forth between two seemingly unrelated plots, I could still follow that through line better than this one. The rest of the production is pretty much a lateral step from the last two films. It has the same high and low points. The sets are fine, the stunt work is solid, the music has a few bangers, and there's some excellent miniature and special effects works, mixed in with some bad rear projection shots and the hilariously bad dummies. The action, unfortunately, takes a general step down. I don't care for the fire truck chase, with another instance of comedic cops. The fight at Stacy's house just passes by without much fanfare, though I love the gag with the gun. The horse race is okay, and the fight in the warehouse is one of my least favorite instances of Bond fighting some goons. There are still a few high points. I like most of the skiing action and how it transitions from skis to snowmobile and then to snowboarding. However, I have the same problem with it that everyone else does. That stupid song. It is ridiculous and makes the scene an insipid joke. The car chase through Paris is neat, featuring great stunt work from Remy Julien's driving team, and the idea of Bond's car being chopped up is great. By far, the best action sequence in the film is the Golden Gate Bridge. The setup to this is pretty clunky. How long can Bond hold on to the mooring rope, and how much chalk does he have coming out of those hands? But the actual scene is inspired. Using a combination of miniatures, rear projection, studio work, and actual footage from the bridge, it's the most energetic part of the movie, complete with John Barry's great action piece. Even though the rear projection shots are dodgy, I still feel a great amount of tension while watching this, and I'm fully invested in the moment. Well done, folks. I can't pass up the opportunity to talk a little about the music. I'm mostly on the same page with everyone else about Duran Duran's title song. The lyrics make no sense, but it's so catchy and filled with such a life that the rest of the film is lacking that it stands out. It was the last song Duran Duran did as a group before they split up the first time, and it stands as a fan favorite. I only wish Maurice Binder's title sequence accompanying it was a bit better. There are undoubtedly some great images here, but much of it feels awkward and poorly lit to me. The actual score by John Barry is fine, though I've never understood how some people put the entire score as one of the best in the series. The best pieces are the instrumental versions of the title song, and a stellar action piece that gets constant reuse throughout the film. But beyond that, there are a few pieces or sections that I can recall. I don't think Barry ever did a bad Bond score, but this is not one of his best efforts. The film ended up being a bit of a swan song for several key people in the Bond series. Obviously, this was Roger Moore's final Bond film, as well as Lois Maxwell. However, several key people ended their tenure with Bond here, like cinematographer Alan Hume, who had done the last two Bond films and had also done Return of the Jedi. Martin Grace, one of the great stunt people in the business, also left. He narrowly escaped death on Octopussy and had done work as far back as You Only Live Twice. Willie Bogner Jr. makes his fourth and final effort for the ski sequence here, but the biggest blow to me is Bob Simmons. His contribution to the series is legendary, having done work on all but 3 official Bond films up until 1985. including standing in for Sean Connery during the first gun barrel of the series. The Bond films almost always achieve top marks in their stunt work for me, and Bob was the man who paved the way for all to follow. A View to a Kill overall is not a film that inspires much confidence in the future of the series. The modern influence jars with the routine elements, making the film feel both anachronistic and yet entirely of the time. Either way, the movie feels dated in a way that few Bond entries do. If you have an affinity for the mid-1980s, I imagine you're far kinder to this film than the majority of fans, and I can't blame you. However, I don't, and despite the film's more alluring qualities, it remains as one of my least favorites. I do think I've been too rough on this one in the past. It's a better Bond film than its critics have made it out to be, but given the company of films it belongs to, it does inevitably shift towards the lower end of the rankings. Professional critics have always been quite harsh on this film. It stands as the lowest rated of the official films on Rotten Tomatoes, and box office-wise it earned less money than its predecessors, though still enough to be qualified as success. The Bond series is one of the longest lasting in film history, and that sameness of the formula that I talked about earlier is part of the reason why. Much like the Legend of Zelda or Mario series in video games, the individual entries don't vary wildly from each other that much, but there's still nothing quite like a genuine Bond film when it achieves its objectives. I love this series wholeheartedly, and I'll happily put in an official Bond film before I switch on most any other film. But every series has its low points, and I put A View to a Kill squarely in my personal bracket of that distinction. I still enjoy discussing the merits of the film with its fans, but the deficits are enough to turn me away from it most of the time, and it's rarely even in my top 15 choices of films to rewatch from the series. The filmmakers were definitely feeling the need to shake some things up, and with Roger finally departing from the role, the time felt right to usher in the fourth Bond actor and hopefully re-energize the series for a new generation. When I think of Roger Moore, I have nothing but respect and admiration for the man. He took over the role when the series seemed to be at its most dire, and he had to win the whole world over. If he had failed, the Bond series would have quickly faded out, and it likely would have been amongst the likes of the Pink Panther series or the Harry Palmer series, icons of the 60s but whose flame was extinguished soon into succeeding decades. Thankfully, Roger made a case for a different type of Bond than what Sean had pioneered, and many of us were welcoming to that offering. It did stick around for too long, and some of the more outings are amongst the most criticized of the series. But anyone who can help someone get over the huge heartbreak of a first love's departure is doing something right, and Roger should be honored for his efforts. Plus, the man has become one of the most steadfast ambassadors for the series. Many of the Bond actors have expressed a reluctance to talk about their time, often coding interviews with feelings of embarrassment or resentment. Not Roger, though. He came in on his own terms, he left on his own terms, and he had great fun while doing it. He makes a lot of self-deprecating jokes, and he was often in good spirits when talking about the series, whatever his personal feelings were. He thought of the films as, quote, damn good entertainment, and he put in a lot of work to make them as such. Many younger fans tend to think of him as a clown in the role, and I can certainly see why that sentiment is shared. However, I would argue that Roger did take the role seriously throughout. Look at something like Moonraker or Octopussy. Despite the craziness surrounding him, his Bond always stuck to the mission, and he plays it with a sense of verisimilitude. The work doesn't faze our leading man, and thus it's easier to go along with the antics. My big problem with Roger's era, though, is that the man never felt much like a human being. I've always preferred the films to have a sense of grounded reality to their ridiculous fantasies, and to have a man at the center who can make mistakes and be hurt. It's mostly personal taste that makes me lean towards some of the other actors, though that's not to say that one take is inherently better than the other. Way back in my initial Bond ranking video, I mentioned a litmus test amongst fans that helped you peg which films they tend to like. To refresh your memory, which Bond film is better, From Russia with Love or Goldfinger? If you like Goldfinger more, chances are that you lean towards more of Roger's films. If you like Russia, you'll probably gravitate towards the lower-key adventures with more espionage and a down-to-earth feel like Casino Royale or The Living Daylights. Let me make it clear, Neither is the right choice or is inherently filled with better films, it's just an inclination. And I happen to fall on the side that steers me away from Rogers films. I still highly enjoy a lot of them, and I definitely have a few to recommend to anyone who is curious. Yet in a series of 25 official films, it's understandable if not all are of the same caliber. Rogers never been my favorite Bond, but I rejoice in the good work that he did, and he does bring a smile to my face, even if sometimes that smile is because of some of his film's more notorious aspects.